I'm sure will say that they are standing with Ukraine, providing assistance, and that they want to maintain a partnership with the United States against Russia that is actually the aggressor, and that peace should be built on a solid ground rather than on Putin's manipulation.
Yeah, that is perhaps why we saw President Zelensky say a little bit earlier on X, peace through strength, and President Trump has that strength. We are waiting for President Zelensky to be leaving the Ukrainian embassy. I think we have some images of that as well. He has been there this morning. He's been meeting with the special envoy from the U.S. There you have the images from here in Washington, just outside the Ukrainian embassy. He's been meeting with General Keith Kellogg, who we know is the U.S. special envoy, who has been a very vocal supporter of Ukraine and an ally, if you will, of President Zelensky. So we're waiting to see when President Zelensky will leave the embassy. But first, we're expecting European leaders to arrive to the White House. So, Ursula, as we look at these images, we know from the U.S. side, a White House official has told the BBC who will be on hand for that bilateral meeting between President Zelensky and President Trump. There will be the U.S. Vice President. There will be the U.S. Secretary of State on hand, Special Envoy Witkoff, as well as Special Envoy Kellogg. What do you make of that setup, and what that might tell us about what this meeting might be like?
That's important meeting where I'm sure President Trump will present an outline of a deal that Russia could agree to. And that is based largely on what has been negotiated with Witkoff. And we don't know if there are any concessions from Russia that Putin personally made to Trump in the Alaska meeting. There's some reporting that it really angered Trump when he has heard about Russian demand to receive all of Donbass and for Ukrainian army to withdraw from its legal territory, and that Zelensky will try to convince Trump that the current line of contact, the current front line, should be the starting point to discuss the control and governance of territories, because this is what it is about. It's not about recognition. It's about control and governance of these territories. It's a very high-level meeting, and much depends on something that was probably discussed behind the scenes, and that could be that arrangement for security for the rest of Ukraine. Because if you look at Ukrainian public opinion, and Zelensky knows it, Ukrainians would be willing for some territorial concessions if their sovereignty is firmly guaranteed. And for that, Ukraine needs this cast iron security arrangements, collective that includes United States.
When you say some concessions, do you mean that that could indeed include Crimea, if not the Donbass region?
This is an important point. By concession, I mean that Ukraine agrees not to mount a military campaign to liberate its legal territories. This would be a concession of Ukrainian part. For example, to withhold drone strikes, to withhold any military activities on these territories and consider them temporarily occupied by Russia.
Okay. That is a really important point, as you say, on how the Ukrainians see what a concession might look like. I just want to add that President Zelensky is holding talks with the Finnish president, Alexander Stubb. Those meetings are underway. It's a preparatory meeting ahead of the talks with President Trump. Important to note that the Finnish president was also arriving a short while ago at the Ukrainian embassy. So that is where they are holding talks. We showed you those live images a short while ago of the embassy. So first, President Zelensky holding talks with General Kellogg, and now with the Finnish president. Also important to note, the Finnish president, Alexander Stubb, has developed a uniquely close relationship with President Trump. We know that they text each other often. Alexander Stubb has a good golf game, we understand, something that the U.S. president quite appreciates, and so they're closely in touch. All of this, Ursula, as we know, European leaders are prepared to take a stand here, if you will. But to what extent do you think they can influence President Trump on his position?
Well, yes, Suni, that is a big question. How much Trump may change his position if he sees that key European leaders like Prime Minister Starmer, Chancellor Merz, President Emmanuel Macron are all there and all speaking with the united voice of what should be actually the arrangement of the peace deal and an outcome of this war. It's interesting, the example of Finland was often given to how this war may end, that Ukraine, like Finland after its war with the Soviet Union, may lose some territory, but will maintain its independence. And this is key, that Ukrainian sovereignty should not be curtailed. And this is where the sticky question of future membership in NATO comes. Because why should this be negotiated with Russia, the outline and the membership of NATO? This is the question for discussion between allies. And to be honest, I think it's a serious concession to Putin if Trump has promised him that this will be the case, that Ukraine will never join NATO. To be honest, it's not up to Russia to decide what kind of alliances Ukraine belongs. And President Stubb of Finland was very vocal, saying that he would not recommend Finlandization of Ukraine as an example, because Finland's sovereignty was limited. It had to remain neutral, had to maintain large army, one of the largest in Europe. Now Ukraine beats Finland, unfortunately, in order to protect itself from the USSR and all the skirmishes there were between Finland and the Russian Empire in the past.
Okay, Marisa Lucevic, thank you so much for that analysis. That input will, of course, be speaking to you through the course of the day. Great to get your insights. Now, on where President Trump stands, we spoke a little bit earlier to Lynn Sweet. She is a special correspondent for Chicago Public Media, someone who's been following the White House politics in Washington here for many years, and she told us a bit more on her perspective.
It's not only looking for Zelensky, in a sense, to be obsequious, which is why not if you get to your goal. I think Trump will also be looking for some kind of homage paid by the European leaders. That's why this is so tricky, because you're dealing with diplomacy wrapped in the ego of an increasingly authoritarian American president who is desperate for a deal on almost any terms without offending Vladimir Putin too much. So that all that stuff just complicates an incredibly complicated situation. And what I think could be the fascinating thing here, usually diplomacy happens with things at this level pre-baked. They kind of know what the outcome is, and all these heads of states come together to just put the stamp of approval on it or make minor changes. Here, we're watching this being cooked in front of us. It's as if it's, we're at the restaurant, we have some ingredients, we have all these chefs, and they're all cooking together, and they kind of don't know, though, what are we making? And, the outlines are there, but I go back to the core point. Will President Trump see that giving up land, that is Ukrainian land, is seen as a concession or a surrender and not a swap? I just don't see how these talks go through unless there is an alignment on this view of land for peace.
Okay, that was Lynn Sweet speaking to us a little bit earlier. Just to give you a sense of what is happening at this very hour, we are, of course, here at the White House. There is huge media presence, so much interest from journalists around the world. We're starting to see some of those security arrangements getting in place, because in about 40 minutes or so, we're expecting European leaders to arrive here. What is happening here in Washington, D.C. in the meantime is at the Ukrainian embassy. We have seen President Zelensky. There you see those live images of the Ukrainian embassy. President Zelensky has been holding meetings to prepare for these talks at the White House today. He's been meeting with the Finnish president, Alexander Stubb, and we understand that the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has also arrived at the Ukrainian embassy, where he is also holding talks. So some last-minute meetings taking place there. Earlier today, we mentioned that the U.S. envoy to Ukraine, General Keith Kellogg, held talks with President Zelensky as well. Constructive talks, positive talks, at the end of which President Zelensky said only strength through peace can end this war, and only President Trump has that strength. So that gives you a sense of some of the messaging, the coordination that we're seeing on the European side with President Zelensky before these talks go forward. So you can see there are plenty of activity outside the Ukrainian embassy. We will keep an eye on the latest here at the White House as well. We'll take a short break first. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News.
Welcome back to BBC News. We'll be back at the White House in the next few minutes, but let's turn to the Middle East for the next few moments because Hamas has informed mediators that it approves the latest Gaza ceasefire proposal. That is what a group official has told the Reuters news agency. AFP are also reporting this, that a Hamas source who requested anonymity told them that Hamas has delivered its response to the mediators, confirming that Hamas and the factions agree to the new ceasefire proposal without requesting any amendments. A Palestinian official earlier today told AFP that mediators had proposed an initial 60-day truce and hostage release in 2 batches. Well, let's go live to our Middle East correspondent, Emir Nader, live there in Jerusalem. And Emir, tell us more.
Well, what we understand is that this proposal is been based on a proposal originally put forward by the US envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, earlier in June. We've heard from a Palestinian official familiar with the talks that is what this 60-day ceasefire proposal is based around. It would see hostages and Palestinian prisoners exchanged in 2 batches over those 60 days. So an initial release of living Israeli hostages of perhaps around 10. That's around half of the Israeli hostages in the Gaza Strip, believed to still be alive still, and a number of bodies of Israeli hostages. And then there would be negotiations during this period ongoing for a permanent end to the war. That was the proposal put forward by Steve Witkoff earlier this year. We understand from Palestinian officials familiar with the talks that it is the proposal that has formed the basis of what Hamas have agreed to today. It was put forward to them in Egypt, where there have been these very reinvigorated negotiations, discussions ongoing in an attempt to avert Israel's planned invasion of Gaza City, which could have very huge, untold consequences for the million Palestinians that are there. So it's really focused minds. What we don't know is how Israel may respond to this. This will be seen as a partial deal, i.e. a staged release of hostages. And just last week we heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu that the door has closed to partial deals and that he wants to pursue only a comprehensive deal that would see the release of all Israeli hostages. However, he will be expected to respond to this, and there are many details that we aren't aware of, many details that involves, for instance, the day after, many details that will need to be worked out. Indeed, one of the key sticking points that undermined this proposal put forward by Steve Witkoff the first time is that Hamas really wants any release of hostages to lead to a permanent end to the war. So they, no doubt, will be seeking and perhaps have been given some indication of assurances that if they are to engage with this and release hostages, it will indeed lead to a permanent end to the war.
Aminata there in Jerusalem, thanks very much. Those live pictures that you can see, as Amir was bringing us, the latest there from the Middle East, that is the Ukrainian embassy in Washington. A whole series of meetings ahead of that absolutely crucial meeting that comes later between President Zelensky and Donald Trump at the White House. And then after that, of course, the European leaders meet with the US president. More coverage from Washington live on the programme here in just a moment or two. Don't go away.
Live from the White House, this is BBC News. Leaders gather for crunch talks in Washington in what President Trump describes as a big day at the White House with the aim of ending the war in Ukraine. President Zelensky says, quote, Russia must not be rewarded for invading Ukraine ahead of talks with Donald Trump. It's their first meeting in the White House since that awkward exchange in February. Well, the talks come as deadly Russian attacks on Ukraine continued overnight. Officials in Ukraine say at least 10 people were killed in strikes on Kharkiv and Zaporizhia.
Also on today's programme, Hamas tells mediators they approve the latest Gaza ceasefire proposal as pressure continues to grow on Israel to allow more aid into the territory. We'll have a report from Lise Doucet, who's been to the Rafah crossing.
The stories that we're receiving from across the border on a daily basis is that more and more Gazans, especially children, are dying of hunger.
Warm welcome to our programming here. Our continuing coverage of the talks at the White House today. President Trump will be hosting Ukrainian President Zelensky and a number of European leaders. We are just about half an hour away now from when we're expecting European leaders to arrive at the White House. President Zelensky shortly afterwards, and then he will go into a bilateral meeting. And just to give you an idea of the choreography of that, we're expecting President Trump for that bilateral meeting to be accompanied by his Vice President, J.D. Vance, his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, his Special Envoy, Steve Witkoff, and his Special Envoy to Ukraine, General Keith Kellogg. We understand that President Zelensky will be accompanied by Andriy Yermak and also by Mr. Umerov, who was formerly the defense minister, now is the head of the National Security Council. And as we look at these pictures here of the White House, I want to bring in Vitaly Shevchenko, who is the Russia editor of BBC Monitoring and has been following really all of the latest lines on this. And, you know, Vitaly, as we have seen President Trump speaking on social media this morning, he's been posting several items about what he sees as his goal, and he says, I will get things done. How are how are Ukrainians viewing this morning?
Well, there's an official side to the Ukrainian reaction and the less official side. Officially, Sumi, they are trying to put a brave face on it. Volodymyr Zelensky, for example, when he posted on social media about his meeting with Donald Trump's envoy for Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, he said he was thankful. He said that Donald Trump had what it takes to make Russia stop attacking Ukraine. And he said this needs to be done through force and strength. And the point that he kept making in his statements was that he was thankful. And of course, that's probably a response to the explosive meeting that the two presidents had here at the White House back in February. So he's trying to avoid that. In Russia, there's an expectation of Donald Trump delivering the Russian message, as it were. One line of argument I keep hearing on Russian state television is that it's Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin who will be deciding the fate of nations such as Ukraine, and Europe has been sidelined. Interestingly, I've been seeing clips of a Russian tank attacking Ukrainian positions in Zaporizhia region, and there are two flags on top of that Russian flag, one Russian, the other American.
Fascinating, Vitaly, really interesting. And we're keeping our eyes, you see on the right-hand side of your screen there, on the Ukrainian embassy here in Washington, where we know President Zelensky first held talks with General Keith Kellogg, the U.S. Special Envoy to Ukraine, then also with the Finnish President, Alexander Stubb, with the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer. So these are preparatory talks, Vitaly, ahead of the summit here in the White House. Just what do you think European leaders are saying to Volodymyr Zelensky on how to prepare for this and what message they will all be giving to Donald Trump?
I think the European leaders' message to Volodymyr Zelensky would be to treat Donald Trump gently and tailor his message to the American leader appropriately, given what happened here in February. What both the Ukrainian president and his European leaders will be keen to avoid is Donald Trump helping Vladimir Putin defeat Russia, for example, by accepting Vladimir Putin's demands, such as the demand that there's going to be no ceasefire until some sort of a more permanent solution. This is the line that we heard from Donald Trump following his summit meeting with Vladimir Putin on Friday in Alaska. So that sent shockwaves across Ukraine as well as European capitals as well. The optics of that meeting in Alaska, there were also shocking for Ukrainians, given that Vladimir Putin received literally a red carpet meeting in Alaska, and at one point he was applauded by Donald Trump, despite what the Russian army has been doing in Ukraine, all the civilian deaths. So those are not the kind of optics Ukrainians wanted to see ahead of the talks here in Washington. And also, Donald Trump's posts on Truth Social. I mean, Sumi, I've been hearing the same messages on Russian state TV for years. Ukraine will not be able to join NATO. Ukraine will not be able to get Crimea back. And the quickest way of ending it is for Volodymyr Zelensky to stop fighting. I've heard it before.
Okay, Vitaly, always great to get your analysis. We'll be coming back to you through the course of the day as things start to heat up even more here at the White House. And we should say we've seen from reporters here in Washington that French President Emmanuel Macron has now landed in Washington just about 10 minutes ago, and he's heading directly to the White House, so not to the Ukrainian embassy first, but that is the latest we're hearing on the arrival of European leaders. Now, Vitaly there was speaking about the terrible strikes overnight in Ukraine, hitting Zaporizhia, hitting Kharkiv. We know that President Zelensky has condemned these attacks, saying President Putin is trying to humiliate European leaders. These peace talks taking place at the White House today. Well, Merlin Thomas from BBC Verify has been looking into these strikes and assessing just the damage that has been done.
On the eve of talks between the US and Ukraine about the war, there is no sense of pause in the fighting. But Russian strikes in Ukraine have continued at pace, showing no signs of letting up. Early Monday morning, a Russian strike on a residential building in Kharkiv killed at least 7 people and injured many more. That's according to officials. Photographs we've reviewed also show bloodied and injured people being helped from the scene. One shows a firefighter holding the body of a small child. But because the picture is blurred, we don't know whether this is the child authorities say died in the attack. Russian strikes also hit Odessa overnight. This verified video shows the aftermath of a strike on a reported fuel facility. Verified footage also shows the aftermath in the city of Zaporizhia, where we can see a damaged row of shops, at least 2 of which are on fire. The Ukrainian Air Force said that Russia had launched 4 missiles and 140 drones across Ukraine, which they said hit 25 locations. Ukraine, in turn, has increased its drone attacks on logistics and energy infrastructure in Russia and Crimea, which Moscow illegally annexed in 2014. This map shows 27 drone attacks that we've tracked together with colleagues from BBC Russian in the first 2 weeks of August. You can see incidents we verified in blue and reported attacks in red. Targets have included railway stations, airfields, drone storage facilities and industrial sites. We've confirmed 6 oil refineries have been struck, some several times. And this is the situation on the ground. The areas highlighted in red here are those under Russian military control. And Russia has been making incremental gains, particularly in Ukraine's east in the past few months. Sometimes that progress has been slow and at massive cost in casualties. According to the UK's Ministry of Defence, these incremental advances would mean it would take Russian forces approximately 4.4 more years to gain 100% control of the 4 Ukrainian regions Russia claims in the east and the south. But it should be said, Russian advances appear to have accelerated in the east since the beginning of August, against the backdrop of diplomatic talks.
Well, President Zelensky has been very clear. He has said Ukraine must be involved in any decision about its own territory. We want to show you a map of the situation on the ground in Ukraine at the moment. As we know, fighting is ongoing. You can see the Russian-controlled areas in the east marked in red. It's the Luhansk and Donetsk areas which make up the Donbas region, rich in minerals that the Russians want in any final settlement. That includes parts still currently under Ukrainian control. So that is the situation on the ground. I want to bring in our State Department correspondent, Tom Bateman, again. Tom, we've just been taking a look at that map. And, you know, when we see what President Trump has posted again overnight and into today, he has said again that he thinks Ukraine should not be asking for Crimea back. Crimea was, of course, annexed by Russia in 2014. What do you make of that messaging and what we've seen from President Trump?
I think the signals from President Trump are not very good for Ukraine, basically. I mean, to start off, ahead of a meeting which could decide Ukraine's fate today by saying you're not going to get NATO, you're not going to get Crimea, forget it, after he's met Vladimir Putin just on Friday, is not going to give the Ukrainians much confidence. He also doesn't seem to be in a very good mood, frankly. I mean, he's been complaining a lot today about what he sees as the way the media is portraying the outcomes of his Alaska summit, and he's not very happy about that. And also about a raft of other issues, basically, which doesn't give you a sense that he's going into this in a frame of mind that might be particularly amenable to some of the arguments the Ukrainians and the Europeans are going to make. That's important. I mean, look, we're sort of 20 minutes until the Europeans get here, an hour and 20 minutes till Mr. Zelensky gets here. The media, a small number of media will be allowed into the Oval Office for the very start of that bilateral meeting with Mr. Zelensky. So that's the first time he'll have been in the Oval Office since he was humiliated by Mr. Trump and J.D. Vance back in February, creating this not just incredibly high pressure moment, but very high profile moment once again in the Oval Office for Mr. Zelensky. And what he has to try and do here today is hang on to as much of his own country as he can, knowing that Mr. Trump has basically pivoted his position towards that of Moscow, which is haggle over territory first, and then we'll deal with stopping the fighting second. Exactly the position the Europeans have been desperately trying to prevent.
Yeah, this meeting will be different from February because President Zelensky will be joined by European leaders, a massive show of solidarity from European leaders today. To what extent do you see them pushing President Trump to move back to their position, which is there has to be, as you said, a ceasefire before any agreement?
Well, this is the absolutely fundamental question about today, is that on the one hand, the Europeans are here, as they say, as a show of unity to give a sort of bedrock of support to Ukraine, thinking of the future for European security. But there is another part to this, which is, frankly, the Americans are quite happy that the Europeans are going to be in the room with Mr. Zelensky. We heard from Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, yesterday, saying actually it's good to have the Europeans in the room because, if we need the Ukrainians to make accommodations to come towards the position that Mr. Trump is going to be pressuring them on, they feel actually the Europeans can support that to some extent. So it's not absolutely clear that the Europeans are going to be able to back Mr. Zelensky 100%. Are they going to risk a rift between, powerful Western European nations, between themselves and the US, the bedrock of transatlantic security, that relationship since the end of the Second World War, over the issue of territory in Ukraine? So we're ahead of an absolutely fundamental and historic moment here, which risks the potential for a bust-up between America and its European allies, hanging on this question of territory, as it seems increasingly likely Mr. Trump is going to press the Ukrainian leader to hand over bits of territory to the Russians after that meeting on Friday. And what is being dangled in terms of a security guarantee backed by the Americans is far from clear at the moment that quite adds up to everything that Mr. Trump's chief negotiator, Steve Witkoff, said it did yesterday. It does seem possible he has potentially once again got the wrong end of the stick after hearing from the Russians, and that they're not quite prepared to offer the guarantees to Ukraine that perhaps some in Europe hope they might.
Yeah, some real questions and potential for tense meetings today in the White House. Tom Bateman, thank you again. We'll let you go and do some more reporting ahead of European leaders arriving here. But on this question of territorial concessions, on this question of security guarantees, I spoke a little bit earlier to Shashank Joshi, who's a defense editor at The Economist, and he gave me his perspective.
The real challenge for European leaders here is to push back at what appears to be the most egregious element of the peace proposal that is on the table, and that is Ukraine handing over territory that Russia does not presently control, but doing that in a way that doesn't precipitate the sort of rupture that we saw back in February that Ambassador Fried mentioned with Zelensky in the White House, and the early signs coming out of President Trump's social media feed, which is, of course, a kind of, his innermost thoughts published on the internet seconds after he seems to have them, is that he still feels Zelensky has little leverage, that Zelensky has to make the concessions. And I think that's all pretty ominous for the leaders gathering in Washington today.
To be here with him. He loves these.
So what kind of room to maneuver do you think they have then, Shashank, looking at some of the messaging we've heard from them in advance saying we stand by Ukraine's side, and President Zelensky himself saying that, Russia must not be rewarded?
I think the strategy that they will have is to make sure that President Trump can save face. It cannot be that he emerges from Alaska and has nothing to show for it, that he walks away completely. So I think the strategy will, to some degree, be yes, but. Yes, Mr. President, this is the right time for a deal. Yes, perhaps we can take your favored approach, the Russian approach, of going straight to a final settlement, skipping a ceasefire up front, which is a change in the U.S. position. But they will be saying, let's think about freezing the current lines and a serious security guarantee with American backing for a European reassurance force inside Ukraine. But under no circumstances should we be pushing President Zelensky to hand over territory that isn't controlled by Russia today. And I think they'll say that on the basis, first of all, that Zelensky cannot politically survive doing that, because Trump is a politician, he understands some of that, but also that this is valuable real estate from a military perspective. There's a defensive belt in Donetsk province, and I think they will have to get across to President Trump that handing this over will make it more likely that a Russian reinvasion will leave egg on Trump's face. And I think that has to be the message that gets across to the White House in the next 12 hours or so.
Anywhere near Ukraine.
That's a really interesting point that you make there, Shashank. And I'm curious to ask you as well about security guarantees. We've heard some mixed messaging, but Steve Witkoff, the special envoy, saying that the Russians have accepted some sort of security guarantee that is like Article 5. How much would the U.S. be involved with this, and where does this leave Europeans?
Mr. Witkoff has, I'm afraid, a very poor grasp of his brief and of the details, despite having shuttled back and forth between Moscow for many, many months. And that's lamentable. But when he talks about Article 5-like guarantees, and I'm quoting him precisely there, that may sound very positive. The note of caution I would inject here is that back in 2022, Russia and Ukraine did discuss this issue, and Russia did propose what looked like Article 5 type guarantees. However, Russia also specified it would have a veto on whether those guarantees would be active or could be activated, which means you could have had a Russian invasion of Ukraine, and Russia then prevents the other guarantors, including America, from acting on those guarantees. If that is what was proposed in Alaska, and we don't know, then I think that would be a wildly inadequate assurance for Ukraine, which of course has been scarred by some of its history, including the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, in which Russia was a signatory, America was a signatory, and the pledges made in that proved completely inadequate for Ukraine's needs.
Shashank Jockey talking to Sumi a little earlier. Around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News.
Thousands of people have come here to the centre of Seoul this evening. They have come to celebrate the newly elected president, Lee Jae-myung.
He's been firing rubber bullets at the direction of the crowd, and it shows you just how volatile the situation is.
We're seeing scenes of destruction like this one across Mandalay, and the reality on the ground is there just aren't enough pairs of hands.
Given the scale of the attacks we've seen over the past 48 hours, it doesn't feel like we're in ceasefire territory.
There when the story breaks, BBC News.
You're watching BBC News. At this point, viewers around the world are about to leave us just for a few minutes. These are the live pictures from Kyiv, and the smaller inset is the Ukrainian embassy there in Washington. All of that ahead of the crucial meeting that is coming up between President Zelensky and Donald Trump at the White House. Let me show you the pictures live at the White House. We will be back in the next few minutes to bring you every single piece of movement and analysis ahead of that critical meeting.
Stunning lakeside views and postcard-perfect scenery. Lugano is tucked into Switzerland's southernmost canton. But aside from its beautiful landscape, there's one other jewel in the crown of this Swiss Mediterranean city: computational power. This is the home of Alps, not the mountains, but a different kind of giant. One of the world's most advanced supercomputers. It's the latest generation of high-performance computing.
Imagine you have your laptop, but now imagine that you have 10,000 or 20,000 of those laptops. So here we look at extremely capable processors that are more capable than your laptop processor, and we're looking at nearly 11,000 of those. That's a supercomputing center.
Wow.
But such power comes at a cost. Heat. And a lot of it. This isn't your average data center full of noisy fans and air-conditioned chillers. Instead, what's impressive about this place isn't just its brainpower, it's how it's run. Built not only for speed, but also sustainability. Alps draws from the same source that has sustained Switzerland for millennia: glacial water.
When you think of supercomputers, you don't necessarily think of pipes and pumps. What is happening in here?
So supercomputers burn tens of megawatts, and so that turns into heat that you have to somehow remove. And so the setup we have here is we take water from the lake, and this is the big pipe coming in, and then this water goes into a heat exchanger where the water stays in the center.
The centre typically cools around 10 to 15 megawatts, but has the capacity to go up to 25. Water from Lake Lugano is drawn in, where it's typically 7 degrees Celsius. Once used to cool the vast array of technical infrastructure, it goes back to the lake around 15 to 20 degrees Celsius. One level above, the pipes may be smaller, but water is still very much at the heart of the supercomputer centre. Each of the 2,688 blades has a blue and red pipe, colour-coded to avoid confusion during planned maintenance.
So this is the inside of one of these blades, one of these many blades in this system. What are we looking at here?
Okay, so here you have a Grace and a Hopper processor, so a multi-core CPU and a GPU. The cold water comes in here, is distributed, and then comes in, the warm water goes out back into the data center.
By crunching vast amounts of environmental data, Alps helps forecast sea level rise, glacial retreat, and extreme weather events on a global scale.
AI is basically you're building a predictive model based on data. So you could, for example, increase computationally the level of CO2 in the atmosphere. What happens then? what you can now do with those simulations is you can take your little understanding of reflective properties, but you can now scale it up to the whole planet. So these are all things that are not easy to understand, but you can run it in massive simulations like on this machine.
In a world facing both data overload and environmental crisis, ALPS is a chance for technology and nature to work together, setting a standard for how supercomputers stay cool without heating the planet.
My dad was a farmer, but he also had a radio talk show for farmers who called in with their farming problems. He'd patiently listen to every conflicting account of what was and wasn't working. That was really influential to how I approached my journalism. Building trust by taking the time to understand a situation clearly before reporting a story. In a 24-hour news cycle, patience can be so frustrating, but it's a crucial tool. I'm Lucy Hawkins on BBC News Now.
in Washington. Sumi, over to you.
Thank you, Matthew, and indeed welcome to our live coverage here in Washington, D.C. of this high-stakes summit. You see Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, getting into a car there. They are just leaving the Ukrainian embassy in Washington. Critical because we know that European leaders have been meeting with Ukrainian President Zelensky ahead of this high-stakes summit at the White House today. To give you an idea of what's been happening, we saw the Ukrainian president there at the embassy earlier today, holding talks with General Keith Kellogg, who is the U.S.'s special envoy to Ukraine. He then started meetings with European leaders, including the Finnish president, Alexander Stubb, including the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer. He arrived here in Washington just about 2 hours ago, touching down. We believe just about half an hour ago, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, touched down here in Washington. You just saw going in there, that was the Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S., Oksana Markarova. She has been a critical voice here in Washington, advocating for the Ukrainians, working with the administration here, ensuring that Ukraine's position is represented in Washington. She, of course, is taking part in these preparatory talks. Now, to give you an idea of what is going to happen next, we are going to see European leaders arrive here at the White House. If you hear commotion behind me as we're looking at these pictures of the Ukrainian embassy, that is because there is a massive amount of media on hand, Ukrainian media, of course, European media, and media from across the U.S., massive interest. Hard really to overstate how important this meeting is today as we see European leaders arriving in solidarity with President Zelensky. We are watching here leaders, of course, exiting the Ukrainian embassy. They will then head over the short drive to the White House. They will arrive first. There is the shot of the embassy. And after that, we will see President Zelensky arrive here at the White House. What we're going to see then is a bilateral meeting between President Zelensky and President Trump and some of their closest aides and advisors. That includes the U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, with President Trump. And here you can see, this is the image just behind me, gives you a sense of the activity about to happen. But as we were saying, the U.S. Secretary of State, the Vice President, J.D. Vance, the Special Envoy, Steve Witkoff, who's been negotiating on behalf of the U.S., and the Special Envoy to Ukraine as well, Keith Kellogg. Now, on the Ukrainian side, let's bring in my colleague Vitaly Shevchenko, who is the Russia editor of BBC Monitoring. He's been following all the latest. You can see here, Vitaly, that is the image just behind us, and there's a massive media presence. Also, they've been pushed off one part of the lawn, which is why there's a big crowd actually behind us. I see European media who is gathered just ahead of this meeting taking place. But Vitaly, as we wait for these arrivals, give us a sense of what it means on who the Ukrainian president is taking in to this meeting with him. We know he's taking, for example, Andriy Yermak. He's taking Mr. Umarov will be here. We understand other advisors. Give us a sense of what all of this means as he prepares.
Andriy Yermak is the head of Ukrainian presidential office. Some say he's the number 2 in the country. Some say he's number 1 in the country. And that gives us an idea of how influential Andriy Yermak is. So his appearance here in Washington is very, very expected. Rustem Umerov was until recently the Ukrainian defense minister. Currently, he is head of the Ukrainian National Security and Defense Council. Now, importantly, Rustem Umerov is an ethnic Crimean Tatar, and his family was deported by Stalin in 1954 to Central Asia. This is where Rustem Umerov was born, in Uzbekistan. His family returned to Crimea after Ukraine's independence. So there's symbolic value as well in a Crimean Tatar being present at the talks in Washington. And of course, just hours ago, Donald Trump posted on Truth Social, his social network, saying that Ukraine is not getting Crimea back. So a Crimean Tatar at the talks, that's highly symbolic. Now, as for expectations, Andriy Sybiha, who is the Ukrainian foreign minister, he's not here. He was speaking in Kiev today. And he said that Ukraine is not handing Crimea back to Russia or to Russia, whatever anybody says. And he said that Ukraine's expectation is to get more clarity on the security guarantees or potential security guarantees that are on offer, as well as a way forward. But the bottom line, Sumi, is that there's very little clarity on what exactly Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump discussed in Alaska on Friday. All we know is that any potential deals will possibly involve pressure from the United States for Ukraine to give up some of its territory to Russia in exchange for promises on peace. The Ukrainians are saying, no, that's not happening. So a tense situation even before the summit has started.
Tense is the right word. In fact, you can really sense that tension here at the White House. I have to say again, I haven't seen the White House this packed with so much interest in this meeting today. Truly extraordinary to have so many European leaders coming here to the White House with President Zelensky at a time where everything really is at stake, only for European leaders and for President Zelensky, and frankly for President Trump, who has said very clearly, he can get it done. As we're watching these images, let's bring in our correspondents. Katie Watson is in Kyiv. Alicia McCarthy is in London for us. And Katie, starting with you there in Kyiv, we've just been talking to Vitaly Shevchenko a bit about how President Zelensky, his advisors, are preparing for today. How is this all being watched there in Kyiv?
Well, look, it's early evening here in Kyiv. People will be heading home from work and no doubt tuning in to see what the developments will be from Washington. Of course, just a few days ago, they were tuning in to a summit in Alaska to which Ukraine was not invited. This time, their President Zelensky, is at the White House talking to Donald Trump. People here have told me that their hopes are high, but I think their expectations are low. They've been here before. There have been, conversations about ceasefires, about trying to find a lasting path towards peace, and still the war goes on. Just overnight, there were attacks across Kyiv, attacks across Ukraine, the worst in Kharkiv, where 7 people died, including a toddler. And that's what Zelensky has made very clear heading into this meeting, that Russia, he's called a war machine, and needs to be told to stop. And that's something that he will be talking to Donald Trump about, trying to find assurances from the US along with Europe to guarantee Ukraine's security and find a way forward.
Yeah, and Alicia McCarthy, we know that the British Prime Minister has been holding talks with President Zelensky at the Ukrainian embassy this morning, along with other European leaders. Give us a sense of how his office are approaching this today.
And in that video, he talked about the impact of the war and how the Ukrainian people had suffered over the years since it started. But he also talked about the impact that it had had on Europe and on the UK, with thousands of people who fled from Ukraine to come to the United Kingdom. And he said that everybody wanted this to end, it had to come to an end, but he talked about there being a fair and just peace. And he said that there had to be the right outcome for this. So it's clear that he's hoping he can use the relationship that he's built with Donald Trump to have some influence to make sure that Ukraine has a real say on whatever deal is finally agreed.
Okay, we're just seeing images here, Alicia, of the British Prime Minister leaving the Ukrainian embassy, as you've been speaking there. So there we have it. He's leaving the embassy, getting into his car, the convoy, and there you see the Ukrainian ambassador just behind him, and you see Lord Mandelson, the UK ambassador to the US, coming out as well. We know that he has been a close partner to the Trump administration. He, of course, also instrumental in the trade agreement that was negotiated between the US and UK, Lord Peter Mandelson there. And as we're watching these images, as the British Prime Minister has just departed the Ukrainian embassy, heading a fairly short drive over here to the White House, let's bring in James Waterhouse, our correspondent, who is in Brussels for us as well. James, good to have you on, and we know you're, of course, usually in Kyiv, so watching the story really from both angles. But do you have a sense from there in Brussels? We know the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is here, European leaders, how they are preparing for and approaching what might be a really, really tense meeting in the White House today.
Yeah, you really get a sense of the intensive prep that is going on. I think we've seen conferences last week, summits to both get Donald Trump's attention, to mould his thinking, and now it's very much rallying around Volodymyr Zelensky for his Oval Office take two. Now, it is true that since that meeting in February, there have been friendlier face-to-faces between himself and the US president, where clearly he has not aligned, but I would say been more open-minded to Ukraine's point of view, its interests, as he impatiently pursues this peace deal. Now, but there is going to be a point, there is going to be a nervy point where Volodymyr Zelensky will arrive. There'll be all eyes on what he wears based on the criticisms he faced last time. And everyone will be looking on the European side to see if the mood changes like it did last time. I think, watching it from Ukraine the last time around, the way things went south for Ukraine and so quickly was felt so intensely by so many because of what was at stake. Now, in that case, it was a relative setback, but Ukraine has been able to successfully lobby, along with Europe. I mean, it's a success that they are even here in Washington, involving themselves in this process. But, collectively, Europe was able to steer the conversation and the process back towards its own goals. Not completely, as you've seen with this meeting with Vladimir Putin last week. But I think those European leaders, as they wait for Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump to finish their own private meeting, they will be hoping that they're not much needed backup, and actually they can join and reinforce a message that Donald Trump agrees with.
Yeah, that is an important point, isn't it? As they're making their way to the White House, you see these images that we're showing you, live images, just behind where we're standing. The guard set up for the arrival of these European leaders. The crowds keep getting bigger and bigger of media. We're really actually squished in here at the White House as people are reporting live on what's happening here, and we're expecting those leaders to arrive any moment now, really, as they're making their way from the Ukrainian embassy, which is about a 15-minute drive over here to the White House, more like 10 minutes if traffic moves quickly. But let's, as we're waiting, bring in Lee Turner, former UK ambassador to Ukraine, author of Lessons in Diplomacy, Politics, Power and Diplomacy. Lee, how difficult a task is this, do you think, for President Zelensky today?
It's a hugely difficult task that we're facing for both President Zelensky and for everybody else. But of course, Sumi, it's most important of all for President Zelensky, whose country has been under attack now for 9, 10, 11 years since Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine in 2014. We have this extremely puzzling situation where President Trump, having promised to put Vladimir Putin under pressure to force him to come to a ceasefire deal, abandoned all of that when he met Putin in Alaska on Saturday, and instead is now putting pressure on Ukraine to agree basically to everything that Russia wants, which is not only to keep the conflict line where it is now, maybe freeze that, but also to take a large chunk of land in Donetsk Oblast, which Russia hasn't been able to conquer in 11 years of war. So that's a big problem. And then we also have President Trump greeting President Zelensky to Washington by stating on his Truth Social network that Ukraine will never get Crimea back and will never join NATO. And we may ask, why does Trump feel he needs to argue Russia's case just when he's about to meet President Zelensky? It's about the worst augury you could possibly have. So it's a very difficult task that Zelensky faces. But the good news is that the Europeans, in what really is an extraordinary and spectacular show of support, I can't think when anything like this has happened before in recent years, have crossed the Atlantic.
Just Lee, if I can jump in there, we're seeing a first arrival here. Just looking to see who is getting out of the car as we see European. This is Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO. We see getting out, and fitting that he arrives here first. He, as many of our viewers will remember, has developed an especially close relationship with President Trump. President Trump often praising Mark Rutte, saying that he is doing a wonderful job at NATO, pointing to the NATO summit that happened recently, where he was able to convince European leaders to spend 5% on defense rather than 2%, something President Trump is keen to point out often. So there you have the very first arrival at this high-stakes summit today, the Secretary General of NATO. He will be followed shortly by other European leaders. But Lee, sorry to interrupt you there. We were just discussing, of course, what exactly is on the table, if you will, today at the White House. As we keep an eye out for further arrivals, I just want to ask you what you make of this talk of security guarantees. We know that Secretary Witkoff has said, look, it's going to be like Article 5 of NATO. Do you think that is something that will be enough for Ukrainians?
It's a great puzzle what Steve Witkoff, President Trump's envoy, said yesterday. He had raised this idea actually in March in an interview with Tucker Carlson, that somehow the US could offer an Article 5 type protection deal to Ukraine. And I thought then, what on earth does he mean? And I thought this again yesterday when he raised this idea, because of course you can't have Article 5 protection without being a member of NATO. What Article 5 means is that if any member of NATO is attacked, then NATO will come, the rest of NATO, all the other countries in NATO will come to the aid of that country. And it will be great to nail down some of the details of exactly what Steve Witkoff could possibly mean by that.
Yeah, indeed. Lee, I just want to bring in our colleague here, Vitaly Shevchenko, because Vitaly, just behind us, we just saw, oh wait, here we see the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, arriving. There we saw her just a moment ago leaving the Ukrainian embassy, and here she is arriving at the White House for these talks. Ursula von der Leyen heading into the White House following the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte. So now two European leaders on hand. And Vitaly, we were just mentioning, just a moment ago behind us, we saw Mr. Umerov arrive.
Yes, it's the advance party, if you like, of the Ukrainian delegation. The former Ukrainian Defense Minister, Rustem Umerov, now head of Ukraine's National Security Council, accompanied by the head of President Zelensky's office, Andriy Yermak. They walked just past us. They are in the building in the West Wing, so all seems to be set for the arrival of President Zelensky himself. Things are getting on the move here in the White House. There's a palpable feeling of excitement, also apprehension about what is going to happen as all these leaders are converging.
And we mentioned, I think we also got a glimpse of Andriy Yermak, who has arrived as well. Give us a sense of how important a role they play, of course, for President Zelensky in these talks today.
Andriy Yermak is seen by many as official number 2 in Ukraine. Some see him as official number 1. And that gives us an idea about his influence, not just in Volodymyr Zelensky's office, which he has, but also in the whole political arena in Ukraine. So if he had not been included in this delegation, that would have been a massive surprise. But he's there. That's not surprising. It's totally expected. Rustem Umerov, a Crimean Tatar with roots in Crimea, which Donald Trump says Ukraine is not getting back the annexed Ukrainian region, is also here as head of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, formerly defense minister. He still wields a lot of influence in Ukraine. So it's a very representative Ukrainian delegation. They're the kind of people Volodymyr Zelensky will need at his side when he'll be talking to both Europeans and the US president as well.
Just to recap for our viewers, we've now seen the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, enter into the White House. We've seen the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen. The Ukrainian Foreign Pool Press is actually now entering or heading in as well, it looks. One of our colleagues, Miroslava Petsa, is actually part of that pool, so she'll get an on-hand view of what happens in the Oval Office. We're looking here at images of the Ukrainian embassy, of course, where many of those European leaders were gathered today, not including the French president. It looks like the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has arrived. He will now be arriving out of this car as we see him step out of the car and to the White House. As we said, for Sir Keir Starmer, a difficult line to walk today. He and his government have built a close relationship with President Trump. Today, however, pressure will have to be applied on behalf of President Zelensky and the Ukrainians and the European position. So quite a difficult position for Sir Keir Starmer there. One after the other, leaders arriving. You can hear the sirens perhaps, and a lot of, and it looks like from my position, can't see exactly whose delegation that is that's arriving, but leaving the Ukrainian embassy heading to the White House. But that looked like the convoy from the Finnish president, Alexander Stubb, someone who's been really instrumental in negotiations for Ukraine because he's another close friend of Donald Trump. We learned in a recent Wall Street Journal article that he and President Trump text each other regularly at all hours of the day. He loves to play golf, as President Trump does as well, and he's complimented the Finnish president on his golf game. So another leader of Europe who has developed an important close relationship with President Putin. All the better for President Zelensky, of course, who is on hand today and looking to those European leaders and the relationship that they've established with President Trump to be able to put some pressure on the president to understand Ukraine's red lines, if you will. And just to give you an idea, we're all crammed in here. The Secret Service has actually moved many of the media off of a part of the lawn right in front of the White House doors. And that is why you probably hear so many different reporters around us as well. And Lee, I know you are still with us at the moment. Thank you for your patience as we're watching all of these arrivals here at the White House. Lee, tell us what you make of the fact that President Zelensky, the Europeans have said a ceasefire must happen first. But in Alaska with President Putin, President Trump seemed to embrace the position that there would be a comprehensive peace agreement first.
It's a difficult position for both Zelensky and for his European supporters, that President Trump has basically reversed his own position. You may remember back in February, he was putting pressure on Zelensky to accept a ceasefire before a peace deal. And eventually Zelensky did agree to do that. And now President Trump is putting pressure on Zelensky to agree a peace deal without a ceasefire. So the opposite of what he was saying back in February. And the Europeans are watching this. I would include Sir Keir Starmer, although I haven't discussed it with him, sadly. But they're watching these developments, which are basically Trump taking Putin's position as his own and putting pressure on President Zelensky to accept it. They're watching this with horror, revulsion, and dismay. But they have to come to Washington now and hide such horror, revulsion, and dismay, and flatter and get up close to Donald Trump, tell him he's the greatest, as we saw President Putin doing on Saturday in Alaska. And the delegation that the Europeans have sent includes not only the biggest military countries, that's the Germans, the French, and the Brits, but also, as you've mentioned already, Alexander Stubb, Giorgia Meloni of Italy, and Mark Rutte, the head of NATO, all of whom are famous Trump whisperers. This is a delegation teeming with people who know how to get along with Trump. Indeed, Mark Rutte, last time he saw Trump, was roundly condemned after the meeting because he referred to Trump as daddy. And everybody said, really, how can he be so oleaginous and flattering to Trump? But I'm afraid experience of the last 6 or 7 months since Trump became president is that gross flattery cannot be laid on too thickly. And this may be what they need to do to address these two key issues. The first of them is, as you say, the security guarantees. What are they? What are those security guarantees going to be? How will they work? Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, has even thrown some doubt on whether the Russians have signed up to this or whether there is an agreement on these security arrangements. But we need to find out what they are, what is envisaged. And then the other thing is the principle that international borders cannot be changed by force. This principle reinforces all of our security.
Lee, I just want to jump in. Yeah, I just want to jump in. We're looking at some images from at the Ukrainian embassy a little bit earlier, and there you see President Zelensky with the European leaders who are on hand, the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, you see Finnish President Alexander Stubb, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. There they are seated at the table, Ursula von der Leyen, Keir Starmer there as well, as they hold preparatory meetings ahead of the summit with President Trump today. So fascinating images there. I do want to say, just off camera here to the side, I did just spy CIA Director John Ratcliffe. Interesting, he was in Alaska as well for the summit that President Trump had with President Putin. He was standing on the tarmac there as President Putin arrived. Well, just saw him here a moment ago. He was standing just by the White House. And Vitaly Shevchenko is still with me. Vitaly, you have some interesting reporting as well on what you just saw from the Ukrainian delegation heading in.
Yeah, I was looking at that delegation, and I think I spotted Serhiy Palisa, the deputy head of President Zelensky's office. He's the man always wearing military fatigues, and I think he might be carrying a map of some sort. He was carrying a rolled-up sheet of paper, a really big sheet of paper, possibly a map of some sort that the Ukrainian delegation will show to Donald Trump at that meeting at the Oval Office at the White House. And of course, the importance of that map is difficult to overestimate, given all the talk from Washington about territorial concessions that Ukraine might have to make to reach a deal with Russia. So a key Ukrainian official carrying what looks like a rolled-up map on his way into the White House.
Fascinating, fascinating. We are now seeing Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, arrive, someone who President Trump is also fond of. She was here at the White House a few months ago for a bilateral meeting with President Trump. Here she is being greeted before heading into the White House, and we just showed those images from earlier in the morning when Giorgia Meloni was at the Ukrainian embassy alongside her European counterparts, meeting with President Zelensky. She is a staunch supporter of Ukraine as well, someone who has stood behind President Zelensky in his efforts to secure more support for Ukraine from the U.S. as well. So she will likely be a key voice in all of this today. Vitaly just gave us really interesting information, Lee, as I know you're still with us, that the Ukrainian delegation might be coming in with a big map, perhaps, to talk about some of these territories that are being discussed by President Trump. I mean, give us a sense of what you think that negotiation might look like.
Well, geography is a very important part of all this, Sumi. We have seen Vladimir Putin trying to grab a bit more of Ukraine without having to fight for it on Saturday in Alaska. I'm sure that it's a good thing if it's true that the Ukrainians are bringing a map. We know that Donald Trump loves to have visual aids. We saw it when he was introducing his tariffs a while ago, a massive great table of which countries were going to get hit with which tariffs. And I think anything that brings the reality of the situation home to President Trump will be invaluable. How these negotiations will be handled with so many big beasts in the room is really hard to imagine. I can't think of a situation like this where we've had so many European leaders, as well as President Trump, as well as President Zelensky. And of course, each of those main figures, each of those principals has their little group of advisors with them. And what will they do, for example, if Donald Trump sets off on one of his prepared speeches and starts to lay down the law in ways which they consider completely inappropriate and impractical? That will be a really tough ask. And if the European and Ukrainians, or the European and Ukrainian side, wish to make a point, how will they decide who's going to speak? Is it going to be left to President Zelensky? Are they going to pipe up more or less randomly? I'm sure they've been discussing this all in great detail in the Ukrainian embassy, and I hope that they've got their lines cleared as to how to have maximum impact on President Trump.
Likely they were discussing that, Lee, very likely indeed, and how to approach him and what avenues and which approaches will actually work in discussing with President Trump today. To bring everyone up to date, we've seen a number of European leaders arriving at the White House already. The Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, arrived first, followed by the European Commission, President Ursula von der Leyen. Sir Keir Starmer arrived after that, and Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister. We are still, of course, awaiting further European leaders. We have seen the Ukrainian delegation come in already. And we are awaiting President Zelensky himself, who will arrive shortly after that. As we're talking and looking at these images, awaiting more world leaders, let's bring in Sir William Browder, CEO of the Hermitage Fund, head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign. Good to have you back on BBC News. We've seen President Trump writing furiously on Truth Social today about what he sees as disrespectful coverage of his summit with President Putin, and says he will get it done when it comes to ending the war in Ukraine and reaching an agreement. What do you make of what we've heard from President Trump so far today?
Well, it's very disconcerting what we've heard from him today and what we saw in Alaska a couple of days ago, and the general tone. I mean, the very simple fact is that Vladimir Putin and Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. At any point in time, they could stop the invasion. Since Trump has been president, he's made 6 ultimatums for them to cease fire, the Russians to cease fire, and they've refused. And now he's flipped the script, and he said, in order to end the war, the Ukrainians effectively have to capitulate on some type of terms that Putin has relayed to Trump in Alaska. And I think that this is an extremely ugly moment in American foreign policy. It's an ugly moment for Ukraine, and it's an ugly moment for Europe. And I can only hope that with this unprecedented influx of the most important people in the world from Ukraine's allies to the White House, that they might be able to change things back again. And the one good thing about Trump's unpredictability is that he can literally change from 1 minute to the next, and we have to hope that that's what he does here today.
Well, as you've been speaking and we continue to look at these images, we are hearing from the AFP news agency that there are air raids over Kyiv. This, of course, after another horrible night in Ukraine where we saw Zaporizhzhia and Kharkiv hit, 10 people killed. President Zelensky saying that is simply proof that President Putin is sending a message to leaders here as they arrive for a peace summit. But we do see one moment, Bill, before we come back to you, we see another car arriving. We just want to keep our eye on European leaders arriving here. This does look like the Finnish delegation. So Finnish President Alexander Stubb, we mentioned earlier that he was holding talks alongside other European leaders at the Ukrainian embassy a little bit earlier. And we mentioned that interesting reporting about how he has developed a really close relationship with President Trump since he re-entered office, and there you see he's arrived, but also someone who's very clearly standing behind Ukraine, who was really pushed for more support for Ukraine from European allies, and is likely to do so again in the White House today. So more leaders arriving, and Bill, coming back to you, do you think that European leaders here, because of the relationships that they have built, are in a position to be able to really put pressure on Donald Trump?
Well, absolutely. They can both put pressure, but the other thing that we need to understand is that Donald Trump made a very big decision at the beginning of his second presidency, which is that he was not going to provide any more financial aid to Ukraine. And for the most part, that has happened. There's been dribs and drabs, but there has not been any major spending bills in front of Congress for Ukraine to re-up U.S. support for Ukraine. And so one of the big points of leverage, one of the big things that Donald Trump could have done before was to say, I'm going to cut off aid to Ukraine unless you do the following things. He's already cut off aid to Ukraine. And so it's now up to Ukraine, and it's up to Europe and the UK and other allies to continue funding the war. And so to the extent that Donald Trump wants to throw his weight around and wants to determine the outcome, he's lost a very important part of his own leverage, which is financial leverage.
That's an important point that you make there, Bill. And as we're continuing to keep an eye on these images, I just want to bring in a post that President Zelensky has put on Twitter, or X, as it's known now. Let's see if we can pull that up, because he has just put this on and he's written, "Our main goal is a reliable and lasting peace for Ukraine and for the whole of Europe. And it is important that the momentum of all of our meetings lead to precisely this result. We understand that we shouldn't expect Putin to voluntarily abandon aggression and new attempts at conquest. That is why pressure must work, and it must be joint pressure from the United States and Europe and from everyone in the world who respects the right to life and the international order." He goes on to say we must stop the killings, and I thank our partners. And he goes on to say, together with the leaders of Finland, the United Kingdom, Italy, the European Commission, and the NATO Secretary General, we coordinated our positions ahead of the meeting with President Trump. Ukraine is ready for a real truce and establishing a new security architecture. And you can see there that President Zelensky, his team, have posted that video from earlier today of European leaders at the Ukrainian embassy meeting with him. That is the meeting he's referring to there. You see British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer hugs. These leaders, of course, have worked very closely together over the last few months to coordinate their positions, particularly after that disastrous meeting in February at the White House. In fact, it was the British Prime Minister, among others, who were instrumental in reestablishing that relationship with President Zelensky, working to a relationship where the two leaders, Zelensky and Trump, could then start to communicate again. And indeed, we saw the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, say on the Sunday talk shows here in the U.S., look, we've had dozens of meetings with President Zelensky since then, when he was pressed about President Putin being allowed here in the U.S. to visit Alaska. So that message from President Zelensky. Bill, I'll just first get yours, and then Lee, you're still with us. Thank you. Bill, first your take on that message from President Zelensky ahead of these talks.
Well, he's absolutely right. I mean, the one thing that he's pointed out and that is so obvious is that you can't just go to Vladimir Putin and say, Vladimir, be nice, stop doing all this terrible killing, because Vladimir Putin isn't nice, and he's a man who does a lot of terrible killing. And so in order for this war to stop, he's got to feel pressure, and the pressure has to come from a variety of different sources. The biggest source is, if there is any kind of agreement, is some type of threat to him going forward, that if you were to break that agreement, which, by the way, he has done in most other agreements, there will be absolutely unprecedented punishing consequences. But the other thing is, I mean, I don't actually believe this is going to lead to any type of peace. I think it's there's a lot of noise and a lot of drama, but Vladimir Putin doesn't want to end the war. And he's not being forced to end the war. The way you force him to end the war is to put him in a really uncomfortable position. And we haven't done that. And we have the possibility of doing that with sanctions, which, by the way, Vladimir Zelensky has been begging for, which is, if we sanction the Russian oil industry, if we make it impossible for Russia to sell their oil, that would put them out of business, and that would put Putin in a position where he was crawling to negotiate with us. But that hasn't happened, and Trump had threatened that right up until the Anchorage meeting, and then all of a sudden that just somehow disappeared.
And Lee Turner, coming back to you, what Bill was just referring to there, sanctions. Interesting that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, seemed to reject the idea of sanctions in an interview. What did you make of that?
It is extraordinary, isn't it, that President Trump and Marco Rubio seem to be rowing back on the idea of sanctions, when, as Bill said so clearly, the only thing that is going to get Russia to stop this war is either to give them absolutely everything they want, which seems to be what President Trump envisages, or to put pressure on them. And there are many ways that the US could put immense pressure on Russia, including by providing more weapons to Ukraine so it can defend itself better than it's been able to up to now, with dribs and drabs coming in from the US. The problem, again, as Bill points out, is that we are nowhere near a landing zone for a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. Putin is still advancing his maximalist demands, including a rolling back of NATO from Eastern Europe, recognition of 5 provinces of Ukraine as being part of Russia. He wants to demilitarize Ukraine, so they have limits on the size of their army. He wants to basically stop Ukraine from existing. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians don't want to give up land in response to Russian threats. So it's very difficult to see where peace is going to come from. But first of all, we have to sort out this question of what guarantees the US might be able to provide militarily to tease this out. I'm not sure there's anything behind what Steve Witkoff has said, but I hope I'm wrong. And then secondly, we need to find a solution which keeps alive this crucial principle that you can't change international borders by military force. Because if President Putin is allowed to do that, we're all sunk, basically, and we're going to be paying 10 times more for our defense if every country starts invading its neighbor and Russia launches new wars against new neighbors.
That is an important point that we hear many European leaders make, isn't it? That this sends a message to China and other countries if a country like Russia is able to change borders by force. But I just want to bring everyone up to date on what we've been looking at. A number of leaders, European leaders, have arrived. I just saw the German Chancellor. There it is. That's the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz arriving. Remember, he just had his first meeting with President Trump right here at the White House in June. A highly anticipated meeting. Of course, President Trump has been highly critical of Germany, in particular for not spending enough on defense in the past. That has changed as Germany and other countries in NATO have pledged 5% spending. There is Friedrich Merz arriving here at the White House as he is set to meet with his fellow European leaders and hold talks with President Trump a little bit later in the day. Important to note that Mr. Merz and his European colleagues will not meet with President Trump first. We understand President Trump will first be meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky and his delegation. President Trump will be joined by his Vice President, J.D. Vance, by his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, by his special envoy for Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, General Keith Kellogg, and by his special envoy, Steve Witkoff. And Bill, I want to come back to you. We have heard a lot of concern, particularly about Steve Witkoff, about President Trump's special envoy, that he might have misunderstood the Russians at several turns when it comes to security guarantees, when it comes to territorial concessions. What do you make of kind of the back and forth we've seen from different members of President Trump's administration on where things actually stand?
Well, I think there's spectacular disagreement between all of them. Trump's Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, when he was in the Senate, he was one of our strongest allies when it came to standing up to Putin, and surely in his heart of hearts, he understands who Putin is. I know he does because I've spoken to him about it many times. And what he's saying on television is probably a lot different than what he's saying behind closed doors, and I'm sure he's cringing at all this stuff. And I would imagine that General Keith Kellogg, whose I believe daughter is evacuating war victims from Ukraine, also understands what's going on. And so I'm sure that there's a lot of disagreement within the Trump camp. His special envoy Witkoff, who has no experience in Ukraine, is effectively looking at this as some type of real estate type of deal or something, and it all looks pretty upsetting for any of us who have been sort of steeped in the details of this for many years, to watch some of the things that he's saying coming out of his mouth, not just in the last couple of days, but since he's been on this whole story. He's been repeating various Putin talking points. He's been hugging Putin and giving gifts and so on and so forth. And this is not, Vladimir Putin is an indicted war criminal. There is no mystery about who Vladimir Putin is, and to be all this bonhomie and glad-handing and backslapping of a war criminal, it sends the most awful images to anybody who understands who Vladimir Putin is. And by the way, most Americans do understand who Vladimir Putin is. A survey was recently done in the last couple of days, and something like 85% of Republicans and 92% of Democrats think that Vladimir Putin is an evil man. And so it's all very confusing where this is coming from, why this total sort of swimming against the tide coming from the White House when the whole world knows that Vladimir Putin should be contained and not engaged.
Well, certainly will be very different images at the White House today compared to what we saw on Friday, President Putin arriving in Alaska. Here we see European leaders who will be standing at some point literally shoulder to shoulder with President Zelensky of Ukraine. And we understand there will be a family photo as well. And President Trump, for his part, wrote on Truth Social ahead of the summit today that he was honored to invite number of European leaders to the White House for these talks. And I will add that Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, before she arrived here at the White House, she spoke to Italian media, and she said she is happy for the proposal for a NATO-like security guarantee, which Italy first proposed. And she said, we are on the side of Ukraine. We support the efforts of the President of the United States. And she said, I think that the work we will do today will be, from this point of view, very important work. I just want to come back to Vitaly Shevchenko here, our Russia editor of BBC Monitoring. And Vitaly, come back to the point, the reporting you brought us earlier of how the Ukrainian delegation entered the White House. So remind us who is supporting President Zelensky in this meeting he'll have with President Trump, and what you saw from this delegation as they were walking in.
So first of all, he will have his closest aide at his side, Andriy Yermak, the head of President Zelensky's office, a key official in the whole government structure in Ukraine, an official who is a mover and shaker of Ukrainian politics, no less. Also, Rustem Umerov, who is a former defense minister, now head of the Ukrainian National Security Council. And symbolically and importantly, Rustem Umerov is an ethnic Crimean Tatar hailing from Crimea, the region that was annexed by Russia back in 2014. Also there is Serhiy Balisa, a former commander of a Ukrainian military brigade. He always wears military fatigues to official meetings, and he was seen entering the White House, a rolled-up sheet of paper which appeared to be possibly a map, which is important given all the talk that we've been hearing from the White House about Ukraine having to make some sort of territorial concessions. So perhaps the Ukrainian delegation is preparing for just that discussion of what they might be asked or told by the White House to give up in terms of territory, and what the European leaders are hoping to avert.
Well, many of those European leaders having arrived here already at the White House, just to give our viewers a sense, see, these are the images you're seeing. The leaders actually haven't arrived to where the media is, where we are at Pebble Beach. They skirted around this area and arrived at a different entrance. We don't know where President Zelensky will arrive just yet, but we saw him post briefly before coming over about the main goal for Ukraine. And he said, we understand that we shouldn't expect Putin to voluntarily abandon aggression and new attempts at conquest. And Bill, I know you're still with us as we wait for President Zelensky's arrival at any moment. Talk to us a bit about security guarantees. We saw Steve Witkoff talk about Article 5-like guarantees. The Italian Prime Minister we mentioned said that is something that she supports. It's something that Italy had proposed. Do you see or imagine the U.S. being a big part of these security guarantees?
Well, I think that the only way that a security guarantee would hold any water is if the U.S. was part of a security guarantee. And what we've heard up until now is from Donald Trump and from J.D. Vance and from various others is that the U.S. has no intention of getting involved in any kind of security guarantees. Now, that may have changed over the last 48 hours, but that's been their position since February, is that the U.S. wants to put this onto Europe. And I should point out that security guarantees have been signed in the past. When Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons in 1992, the United States, Great Britain, and Russia provided security guarantees. And when Russia then invaded in 2022, those security guarantees weren't worth the paper they were.
I'm just going to jump in there very quickly. If you'd allow me to interrupt, I just want to mention that the French President Emmanuel Macron has just arrived here at the White House. He was the last to land here in Washington. He now arriving to meet with his European counterparts and President Trump. The French president, of course, someone who has also built a relationship with President Trump, but that relationship a bit more thorny in recent weeks, particularly as the French talked about recognizing a Palestinian state in September at the UN General Assembly. We saw that heavily criticized by the Trump administration. Nonetheless, President Macron is seen as someone who does understand President Trump and working with him. But excuse me, Bill, please continue your thought as I just interrupted you there.
Well, the main thought I have is that security guarantees have been offered in the past, very specific security guarantees for Ukraine, protecting their sovereign integrity by the United States, by the United Kingdom, and by Russia. That was called the Budapest Memorandum. That wasn't worth the paper it's printed on. There was also various treaties that Putin has signed since he went into Ukraine in 2014. There was the Minsk I agreement, the Minsk II agreement. He violated those almost immediately. Putin is a guy who will make every type of promise and then violate them immediately and not even blink an eye. And so I think it's the only way to keep Putin in check is to literally keep him in check, physically in check. And the only way to do that is with the might and power of the United States having a real military security blanket over Ukraine if Ukraine agrees to any type of these capitulations that are being forced on them.
Let's also bring into the conversation Frank Gardner, our security correspondent, who is with us. And Frank, I know you've been speaking about the priorities for European leaders ahead of this meeting. We've seen many of them arrive here already at the White House just a moment ago, the French President Emmanuel Macron. Tell us a bit about how you see the Europeans' position ahead of these talks.
Sure. Well, I think you kind of have to separate what I would call the optics from the substance here. And the optics, it's very much about presenting a united front, showing that Europe is right behind Ukraine, that Europe does not want to see any international borders changed by force, which is essentially what Ukraine is probably going to be asked to do, and that it doesn't want to see Russia's aggression rewarded with some kind of a peace deal that gives it a whole block of land and all the mineral wealth and riches that come with that. But this is where I think this is dangerous territory, not just for Ukraine, but also for the transatlantic alliance, because Donald Trump appears having sort of vacillated from being blaming Moscow to blaming Kyiv to blaming Moscow. Now he seems to be more into the kind of, well, the onus is really on Ukraine. If it wants to stop this war, it's got to sign up to this deal. And that deal, as far as we can see, involves Ukraine being forced to give up land that it says it constitutionally can't give up in return for some kind of vague security guarantee. Now, Europe is going to be on Ukraine's side with this, and that risks antagonizing President Trump, who may well decide, you know what, Ukraine, if you're not interested in peace, i.e. surrendering, then I wash my hands of it all.
Lee Turner is still with us. And Lee, we are awaiting any moment now President Zelensky's arrival here at the White House, as all the European leaders have arrived and are set in place ahead of President Zelensky. Lee, we heard President Trump or saw President Trump write on Truth Social a little bit earlier in the day that he sees this meeting as a critical one, a big day at the White House, he said. And he said his critics are jealous that he has not been able to, or they believe he has not been able to bring peace to Ukraine. But he says, I will get it done. I always do. How do you think European leaders can approach President Trump in a way that, as somebody had said a little bit earlier, where he can save face, if you will, push back on President Putin, but also honor what Ukraine wants, what Europeans want here?
I'm sure they will be reassuring President Trump, the European leaders, that he is a statesman of titanic proportions. We saw in some of his posts over the weekend how upset he is that people aren't taking seriously his claim, or the claim of his spokesperson, to have settled 6 wars and to be deserving of the Nobel Peace Prize. Of course, for many people in Ukraine, that would cause hollow laughter, such a suggestion. In a way, we're back where we were in February, where Pete Hegseth, the US Defense Secretary, suddenly said in Munich that President Trump was going to talk to President Putin on the phone, first contact since the main war had started. And Hegseth also declared that Ukraine would have to give up NATO membership and would never get its land back. And at that point, Trump also said he would walk away if there wasn't a deal within days or weeks. And in fact, what's happened is that Trump keeps going round in circles. Yeah.
Lee, I'm just going to jump in here to mention that there's been plenty of activity now at the White House. It appears that President Zelensky's arrival is imminent. We've seen at the doors of the White House the Ukrainian flag placed on the other side of the door of the American flag. The Special Guard is arriving with the flags where they will line the driveway here. We are literally squished in as Secret Service has actually moved a number of the media off the lawn part where traditionally they do report from. And you might be able to hear just behind us, Secret Service is pushing a number of people to move back a bit for security arrangements. Quite a bit of media interest. Really have not seen this many members of the media here for any of the foreign leader visits that we've seen here at the White House. So pretty extraordinary. Underlines once again not only the importance of the meeting, but just how unusual it is to see so many members of the European Union, NATO Secretary General here on hand, these leaders on hand with President Zelensky. We're expecting him to arrive really any moment now. We know that he put out that statement on X right before getting here. But it looks like as they make the final preparations for President Zelensky's arrival here, that Lee, to bring you back into this discussion and just to warn, once President Zelensky arrives, we might just have to jump back in here. But give us a sense what you think might be going through President Zelensky's mind just in these last few moments before he arrives at the White House.
We've seen President Trump repeatedly threatening to walk away from this if he doesn't get what he wants, which seems to be to give President Putin everything that he in turn demands. And it puts the pressure on the Europeans to come up with the goods, as Frank Gardner was saying. Is Europe ready to take up the slack if the US is going to pull away its support from Ukraine? And we're really in a completely new security situation if that happens. That's what President Trump has been threatening all along. And in fact, countries such as Germany, as well as the UK and France, have been pouring money into defense over the last few months. And it may be that a much bigger role for Europe in defending itself and in defending Ukraine may be the price we have to pay for not giving President Putin everything he wants in any eventual peace settlement.
Okay, we are still keeping our eye here, trying to see whether the gate has opened. It looks like from where we are, it hasn't yet, but it's quite difficult from our position. Vitaly Shevchenko still here with us. Vitaly, the final moments now before President Zelensky arrives.
Yes, things are afoot. We have what looks like a guard of honor right behind us down this street or an alleyway leading to the entrance to the West Wing, and there's also a guard of honor with flags at the entrance to the White House. So Volodymyr Zelensky is going to be here any moment now. The moment that a lot of people have been waiting for, and a lot of them have been waiting for it with much trepidation.
Indeed, we have been watching not only the big lines of what these leaders have been saying ahead of this visit, but also things like how President Zelensky has prepared. He's wearing a jacket today, for example, something that was a source of tension, actually, in the White House during his last visit.
Well, during that explosive spat at the Oval Office back in February, he was asked why isn't he wearing a suit. In fact, the first thing Donald Trump said to him at the entrance to the White House, to the West Wing, "Oh, I see you dressed up for the occasion." So Volodymyr Zelensky, we understand, this time around is going to be wearing something that looks like a suit. It's not a suit that I'm wearing, for example. It's a black suit. It has a color, not a classic suit. So it's a compromise, a halfway compromise, having a suit with a collar. So Volodymyr Zelensky will look different. He has been behaving differently on social media as well. In almost every post on social media mentioning the United States, he's been saying, "Thank you, we're grateful, thank you, thank you, thank you." In fact, today in his social media post about his meeting with Donald Trump's envoy for Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, he started it with the word "thank you." So Volodymyr Zelensky has changed his strategy somehow. He's changed his approach to talking to Donald Trump. We'll see if it's going to work.
Extraordinary as well to see those images just a short while ago from the Ukrainian embassy. The European leaders together with President Zelensky really strategizing, weren't they, ahead of this meeting?
Yes, and the reason why they're here, this is an unprecedented meeting held at such a high level. The reason why they thought, well, it's not enough to have Volodymyr Zelensky here alone. We need to be there to give him a backup. The reason is that they're worried that Donald Trump will be helping Vladimir Putin, essentially, by accepting his conditions, such as no ceasefire before a more permanent solution to the crisis of some sort. So that's why they're here. They will be also hoping to avert a repeat of the spat that we saw back in February. So it looks like we will have Volodymyr Zelensky here, backed up by European leaders on the one side, and Donald Trump, who is defiant, no signs of him changing his mind about what needs to be done in Ukraine. Earlier today and late yesterday evening, he's been posting statements that are of really grave concern to the Ukrainians. Things like Volodymyr Zelensky will be able to end this almost immediately if he stopped fighting. The US president also said that Ukraine is not getting Crimea back, it's not entering NATO. All the things that we've been hearing from the Kremlin's media machine for years, now we're hearing them from the US president.
Interesting to note, just as we see these talks likely to get underway in a moment, President Zelensky has not arrived yet, but should be here really in the next few minutes. We've seen a comment by the official representative of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs saying, against the backdrop of the genuine aspiration demonstrated by the leadership of Russia and the U.S. in Anchorage toward a comprehensive, just and sustainable settlement on Ukraine, including the elimination of its root causes. Statements continue to pour in from London, which not only jar with the efforts of Moscow and Washington, but are clearly aimed at undermining them. There, Vitaly, once again, the discussion of root causes, underlining that Moscow's approach and its messaging has not changed.
I think, as ever, we need to interpret messages coming from Moscow and engage in a bit of Kremlinology. So essentially what the Kremlin is saying here is that our goals in Ukraine are unchanged, meaning the very reasons why Vladimir Putin launched his so-called special military operation back in 2022, which is to essentially crush Ukraine as an independent state. So whenever Moscow refers to the root causes, these are the root causes, really. Other statements that we've been hearing from Moscow over the past days also mention how Russia is still determined to have full control of the 4 regions in southeastern Ukraine that it partly controls at the moment, as well as Crimea, which it annexed back in 2014. So as regards Russia's position, it's completely unchanged, and now the White House is keen to put pressure on Volodymyr Zelensky to accept those conditions, which is something that will be worrying both Volodymyr Zelensky and his European allies as they've just come into the White House.
Reminder of what you're looking at here. We are all set for Ukrainian President Zelensky to arrive. You can see the Eisenhower building just behind the White House there. And interesting to note, we've seen all morning a number of people from the Eisenhower offices waiting there on the front steps, also looking to catch a glimpse at what is happening at the White House today, underlining just how extraordinary it is to see so many European leaders on hand. They have all arrived now at the White House. We've seen the first NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte arriving, followed by the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, and then the British Prime Minister, and many more after him, followed, I think, by the last leader to arrive was the French President, Emmanuel Macron. Everything is quite still now here. There's been quite a lot of commotion as Secret Service really pushed everyone up onto a small patch of grass and pavement here where the media are reporting. Now the Special Guard is in place. The Ukrainian flag is on the other side of that door that you see there as we await President Zelensky's arrival. And just a short while ago, we saw President Zelensky write on X that We must stop the killings. I thank our partners who are working towards this and ultimately toward a reliable and dignified peace. He wrote, together with the leaders of Finland, the UK, Italy, the European Commission, and the NATO Secretary General, we coordinated our positions ahead of the meeting with President Trump. Ukraine is ready for a real truce and for establishing a new security architecture. We need peace. So very interesting to hear President Zelensky talking about a new security architecture, particularly as we've seen that statement from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs disputing any of these efforts here that are happening today. We are continuing to watch the gates to see if they open any moment, of course, waiting for President Zelensky to arrive. He will be greeted at the door. Let's bring in Frank Gardner again, who is our security correspondent. Frank, as we are awaiting this last arrival, really, and these talks getting underway, I want to ask you about what President Zelensky wrote there. He said, we're ready for a real truce and for establishing a new security architecture, surely tipping his cap there at the idea of security guarantees.
Sure, well, this is something that the US has hinted at, but what form are they going to take? And I think really this is a square that can't be circled, Sumi, or a circle that can't be squared. Why? Because any security guarantee that Ukraine gets needs to be robust enough to deter any future Russian land grabs. But if it is robust enough, it's very unlikely to be acceptable to President Putin, who Russia has made it very clear in the last few minutes. It's reiterated what it has said all along, is that it will not tolerate the presence of NATO troops under whatever badge or beret or banner they're under in Ukraine. So what form is this security guarantee going to take? It's going to be a very difficult one to try and fudge that. And that really lies at the heart of this, because Ukraine doesn't trust Russia. In 1994, it signed up to something called the Budapest Memorandum, giving up its nuclear weapons, its Soviet-era nuclear weapons, in exchange for security guarantees by the US, Russia, Britain, France, I think, too, and that its borders were supposed to be inviolable. Well, how did that work out?
Very important point that you make there, Frank. And Vitaly is still with us. And Vitaly, as we are waiting President Zelensky's arrival, we are also looking, we should say our Ukrainian service colleagues will be in the Oval Office. That will be fascinating. They'll come out afterwards once the talks are concluded to give us a sense of how things were in the Oval Office. But everyone will remember what happened in February. But this is expected to be a very different picture today.
I think everybody concerned has drawn their lessons, and this is a scenario everybody wants to avoid, I suspect, including Donald Trump himself. That meeting did nothing but cause a huge setback in both relations between the United States and Ukraine, and in the whole cause of ending this war. The fact is that there are still huge obstacles remaining, both in relations between Ukraine and the United States, and also in terms of how this war could be ended. The gap between the positions of the two countries is still huge. Donald Trump has essentially been repeating the Kremlin's talking points over the past few days, starting with how there shouldn't be a ceasefire before a more permanent solution can be achieved, and then things like Ukraine is not getting its territories back, specifically Crimea, occupied in 2014. Ukraine is not going to join NATO, and so on and so forth. So that is upsetting and worrying for Volodymyr Zelensky. And also, this is the reason why all these allies of Ukraine are coming to Washington. Clearly, they feel the need to avert a scenario under which Volodymyr Zelensky will be pressured into giving up territory to Russia in the hope of securing some sort of peace deal. So there are hopes, there are tensions, but it looks like things will be slightly different, starting with what Volodymyr Zelensky will be wearing. It's a suit of some sort, a collared suit, black, slightly different from the classic suit, but still he's hoping to avoid a situation when he will be asked once again by officials in the White House, are you dressed up for the occasion again, like happened the last time? And his rhetoric as well. Since that meeting, he has redoubled his efforts to sound grateful to the Americans. Whenever he posts on social media about settlement in Ukraine, he always mentions America's role and Donald Trump personally. In one tweet in particular, he thanked America 4 times. So this shows how keen he is to show that he's grateful, but he needs help.
And Vitaly, we're just seeing from our colleagues at CBS News here, our partners here in the U.S., that both Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and Chairman of the Joint Staff, General Dan Kane, are expected at the White House today for the meetings with European leaders and with Ukraine's President Zelensky. So that is interesting. Both the Defense Secretary and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they were both on hand for the summit with President Putin in Alaska. So interesting to see that they are expected here at the White House as well. We understand that President Zelensky's on his way here. But Frank Gardner, I want to come back to you with a question about a ceasefire versus a peace agreement. We were just discussing with Vitaly Shevchenko here. We understand that European leaders are going to be very keen to impress upon Donald Trump that a ceasefire must come first. And that is because they believe that Vladimir Putin will only use this time to continue moving the front lines.
So Donald Trump has certainly gone along with Vladimir Putin's idea that ceasefire can wait or perhaps not happen at all, that it's all about addressing the root causes. If you're sitting in DC, and no disrespect to you, Sumi, but I'm really aiming this at the kind of people who think, oh, well, don't worry about a ceasefire. If you're sitting in DC, it's very difficult to imagine what it's like to be droned every single night, because that's what Ukrainian citizens are putting up with in Kyiv, in Dnipro, in Kharkiv, in Zaporizhia, and so on. There are waves of these Russian drones coming across. Now, we correspondents, we do a short stint in Kyiv, and unless we're resident there, we come out. So we only just have a taster of what it's like. And it's pretty terrifying. These things are tipped with explosive. You don't know where they're going to land. Ukraine's air defense tries to shoot them down. But every single night, they hit apartment blocks. We're not talking about soldiers here getting killed. We're talking about families, women, children, men, old and young, getting killed and maimed. That's why Ukraine wants a ceasefire. They're saying we can't be negotiating under fire, not with this kind of barrage being launched against us constantly. But nevertheless, that's where we are. And some people have pointed to the fact that ceasefires don't always really kind of hold, that they're a bit of a flawed solution, which is true. But let's look at the history of the last 6 months. There have been constant ultimatums given by President Trump that he's demanded a ceasefire. Ukraine has said, yep, sure, we'll sign up to that in whatever form you like, whether it's the one in Jeddah back in March or later ones on land, on sea, on air. And the Kremlin has absolutely refused to sign up to these. And because of the very close personal rapport between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin.
Frank, I'm just going to jump in there. Sorry to interrupt you. I just see President Zelensky's convoy arriving here at the White House. He's just pulling up to the gates. We see everyone is in place. You can see just off your camera there, the shot that we have. That is the driveway where President Zelensky's convoy is about to drive up, as we understand. The European leaders who arrived in the last hour or so, they arrived in a different entrance, not where we are, the media here, on what's called Pebble Beach on this main drive. But the White House gates have opened. I just, through the gates, saw a glimpse of the Ukrainian flag on President Zelensky's car or his convoy. Of course, we don't know exactly which car he is in. We know that his advance team, if you will, his closest aides, are already in the White House. They arrived earlier here. We mentioned Andriy Yermak, we mentioned Ruslan Umerov, among those who will be with Volodymyr Zelensky in the White House. Now we are all waiting. It's gotten quite quiet here after such a bustle of activity all day. Media all gathered from around the world, including many, many representatives of European media, with so many European leaders on hand here. It looks like at any moment we're going to see President Zelensky's car pull up, and Vitaly, really a moment of apprehension here, as we've been seeing from our Ukrainian service colleagues. They are concerned, tense, apprehensive over the next moments.
There's obviously no telling of what is going to happen at the White House shortly, but I think you can feel it in the air that it's going to be really important for the fate of Ukraine and other nations as well, Europe in particular, and the huge numbers of journalists and also top leaders arriving here are a sign of that.
They certainly are. They certainly are, and I think this is the moment we're going to see this car pull up. We see the flags moving in place here, and there it is, President Zelensky's convoy arriving at the White House. The Ukrainian and American flags on those cars. We have seen his car pull up. We have seen now the van with some of his delegation pulling up just behind. There you see it in your screens. That is President Zelensky's car. He is pulling around there where he will exit in a moment. The doors are open. We are a bit blocked ourselves by the media presence, but you here have a good shot that you're getting from that pool camera. And here the moment, there is President Trump. There he is, awaiting Volodymyr Zelensky.
President
And let's see.
Your message to the people of Ukraine as world leaders gather here today. Russia continues to attack civilians, this time in Kharkiv, killing many.
If there is just stop the peace on the table, will you see land for Russia?
Okay, there you have it. That was the moment. You heard reporters shouting questions there about a ceasefire. And we saw the two leaders go in. There was a handshake, a pat on the back there. It looked fairly warm, that greeting. We have plenty of media just behind us who have been covering all of this, waiting for that very moment. But that was fascinating, of course, watching President Trump walk into the White House with Volodymyr Zelensky. Just really interesting, as we've all been waiting for that very moment. President Zelensky now in the White House for these critical talks. I think we have General Ben Hodges with us, as well as Vitaly Shevchenko, you see just off the camera. We've been waiting for this moment here, and apologies for this view. We're all literally crushed in here at the White House. We've been pushed into a pretty small area. But General Hodges, if you can hear us, now the tough work begins. President Zelensky is in the White House. He is there with his top team, President Trump with his cabinet members and advisors. What are you looking for now in these coming hours?
Well, first of all, I have to say as an American that it's humiliating that an American president, after decades of American support for the security of Europe against the Soviet Union and Russia, now my president has taken the side of the Kremlin. His terrible announcement yesterday, or his Truth Social, that it was on President Zelensky to end the war. It was incredible to me. And I don't think any other serious person that's listening or watching this believes that the burden is on President Zelensky, or that if President Zelensky says, okay, we surrender, that would be the end of it. So I hope that the European leaders, including Prime Minister Starmer, who have arrived in Washington today, will be able to prevent a catastrophe like happened last time President Zelensky was in the White House, but also to demonstrate that Europe is a superpower when it's combined together, the economies, the defense industries, the populations, it dwarfs Russia. And so Europe has to fill this gap that unfortunately the United States has created.
European leaders, they kind of have to be here.
General, you know, if you look at some of what President Trump has been saying in advance of this meeting, to your point about what you saw as a humiliation of President Putin's welcome in Alaska, for example, his administration, his allies have made the point no one else has brought President Putin to the table. He's the only one who's been able to push the prospect of peace forward.
Well, that is a bizarre take on what's actually happened. President Trump is the only one that thought that has a relationship with Vladimir Putin. Putin is the only guy that President Trump has not harshly criticized. Not once has he or his Secretary of State said that the Russians need to get their troops out of Ukraine. All the other leaders have said that. The American president and his administration have not. I don't understand that. Why in the world would the Secretary of State of the United States say that Ukraine is going to have to give up territory? Why? Why does Ukraine have to give up territory, especially territory that Russia has not even been able to take with force? I don't understand the thinking here. And how is this good for America? This does nothing to improve the economic situation for the United States if Ukraine fails. We don't need Russian oil and gas. So I don't understand, except that I think President Trump, either the Russians really have something on him, or he just wants to be liked by a fellow autocrat. There's no other logical explanation for it.
General, I just want to add that as the President Zelensky and Trump were going to the White House, you might have heard a number of reporters shouting questions to him. One of them was a CBS reporter who asked what President Trump's response was to the people of Ukraine. And he said, quote, "We love them." I think we do have some images of the Oval Office now, a live shot there. Let's see if we can bring those pictures in. There it is.
Well, thank you very much.
Extraordinary images. This might remind many people. Let's listen in.
With us. We've had a lot of good discussions, a lot of good talks, and I think progress is being made, very, very substantial progress in many ways. We had a good meeting, as you know, just a short while ago with the president of Russia. And I think there's a possibility that something could come out of it. And today's meeting is very important. We have, I guess, the seven very powerful leaders from Europe. And we're going to be meeting with them right after this meeting. And thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. If I can, first of all, thank you for invitation, and thank you very much for your efforts, personal efforts to stop killings and stop this war. Thank you. And using this opportunity, many thanks to your wife, First Lady of the United States. She sent a letter to Putin about our children, abducted children, and my wife, she, First Lady of Ukraine, she gave the letter. It's not to you, to your wife.
Oh, I want.
Yeah. So we're saying this sensitive topic. Yeah. Yes, please. And thanks to our partners, and that you supported this format, that after our meeting we can have leaders who are around us, UK, France, Germany, Italy, Finland, EU, NATO, I mean all partners around Ukraine supporting us. Thanks to them, and thank you very much for invitation.
Thank you very much for being here.
President Trump.
Do you think it's fair?
Yes, Peter, go ahead.
Thank you, President Trump. So, President Zelensky, you say in a post on X today, Russia must end this war, which it itself started. President Trump, you say President Zelensky of Ukraine can end the war with Russia almost immediately if he wants to. Which is it?
No, I think that's true. I think we're going to have a meeting. I think if everything works out well today, we'll have a trilat. And I think there will be a reasonable chance of ending the war when we do that.
And is this the end of the road for American support for Ukraine? Is today's meeting deal or no deal?
I can never say that. It's never the end of the road. People are being killed, and we want to stop that. So I would not say it's the end of the road. No, I think we have a good chance of doing it. It's been almost 4 years now that a lot of people were killed last week. A lot of people last week. I mean, millions of people killed, but a lot of people last week for whatever reason. A big number, a lot of soldiers, on both sides. And I know the president, I know myself, and I believe Vladimir Putin wants to see it ended.
And as you met with Putin on Friday, today you've got President Zelensky here. As you listen to Russia and Ukraine, which side has the better cards? Right?
Well, I don't want to say that. I'm just here to be, look, this isn't my war. This is Joe Biden's war. He's the one that had a lot to do with this happening, and we want to get it ended. And we want it to end good for everybody. We want it to end good. The people of Ukraine have suffered incredibly.
And to that point, President Zelensky, are you prepared to keep sending Ukrainian troops to their deaths for another couple years, or are you going to agree to redraw the maps?
Thank you for your question. So, first of all, we live under each day attacks. That today have been a lot of attacks and a lot of wounded people, and the child was dead, small one year and a half. So we need to stop this war, to stop Russia, and we need support American and European partners. And we will do our best for this. So, and I think we show that we are strong people, and we supported the idea of the United States, of personally of President Trump, to stop this war, to make a diplomatic way of finishing this war. And we are ready for trilateral, as President said. This is a good signal about trilateral. I think this is very good. Thank you.
Mr. President,
yes, if the peace deal will be achieved, are you going to be willing to send American peacekeepers to Ukraine?
Well, we're going to work with Ukraine, we're going to work with everybody, and we're going to make sure that if there's peace, the peace is going to stay long-term. This is very long-term. We're not talking about a 2-year peace and then we end up in this mess again. We're going to make sure that everything's good. We'll work with Russia, we're going to work with Ukraine, and we're going to make sure it works. And I think if we can get to peace, it's going to work. I have no doubt about it.
Your team has talked about security guarantees. Could that involve U.S. troops? Would you roll that out in the future?
We'll let you know that maybe later today. We're meeting with 7 great leaders of great countries also, and we'll be talking about that. They'll all be involved, but there'll be a lot of help. When it comes to security, there's going to be a lot of help. It's going to be good. They are first line of defense because they're there. They're Europe. But we're going to help them out also. We'll be involved.
Mr. President, Vladimir Putin mentioned that the war will not end without addressing the root causes of this war. Have you had an understanding what are the root causes of this war?
Well, look, the war is going to end. When it ends, I can't tell you, but the war is going to end, and this gentleman wants it to end, and Vladimir Putin wants it to end. I think the whole world is tired of it, and we're going to get it ended. It was, I've done 6 wars. I've ended 6 wars, and I thought this maybe would be the easiest one, and it's not the easiest one. It's a tough one. A lot of reasons for it, and they'll be talking about it for a long time. But they'll be talking about the others. Look, India, Pakistan. We're talking about big places. When you look at, you just take a look at some of these wars. You go to Africa and take a look at that. Rwanda and the Congo, Republic of the Congo. That's been going on for 31 years. And so we've done a total of 6, and we really have 6, not including the fact that we obliterated, and it turned out to be a total obliteration, the nuclear, as you said, the future nuclear capability of Iran. And this one, I think we're going to get solved also. I feel confident we're going to get it solved.
Thank you, Mr. President. Can you tell us about your conversations with European leaders and what they need to see to support an end to the war?
Yeah, well, we're going to be meeting with a great representative group and 7 very powerful, very big countries and great people, all friends of mine and friends of yours. And we're going to have some suggestions made. They want to see peace. They would like to see peace.
President you said last
in
night
the red.
President Trump, do you think it's fair for Ukraine and for Russia to achieve a lasting and durable peace if Ukraine cedes its territories that Russia hasn't yet conquered? Do you think it's a fair peace for Ukraine?
We're going to have a lasting peace. Just to answer the first part of your question, we're going to have a lasting peace. I hope it's going to be immediately. I hope it doesn't have to go on. And I think people of the whole world is going to be very happy when that's announced.
Mr. President, you posted on social media, Mr. President, a very touching letter from the First Lady. And the letter was hand-delivered to President Putin. And it calls for an end to the war, essentially, because of the children and the children's future. Why did the First Lady feel that letter was necessary? Was it because she believes that Mr. Putin is the aggressor in the war? Is a similar letter being hand-delivered to President Zelensky?
So the First Lady felt very strongly. She's watched the same thing that you watch and that I watch. I see things that you don't get to see, and it's horrible. But when she's got a great love of children, she has a wonderful son that she loves probably more than anybody, including me. I hate to say it, but she loves her son. She loves children, and she hates to see something like this happening. And that goes for other wars too. I mean, she sees the heartbreak, the parents, the funerals that you see on television. Always funerals. We want to see something other than funerals. No, she felt it was a beautiful letter. It was very well received by him, and she did ask me to say, you know, she would love to see this end. She would love to see it end, and she says it very openly, very proudly, and with great sorrow because so many people have been killed.
Mr. President, last week,
Brian, go ahead, Brian.
Yes, sir.
And with great sorrow because so many people have been killed.
Mr. President, last week,
Brian, go ahead, Brian.
Yes, sir. I've got a question for each of you.
Yes.
First of all, Mr. President Zelensky, you look fabulous in that suit.
I said the same thing.
Yeah, you look good.
I said the same thing.
Yeah, looks good on
I
you.
said to the one that attacked you last time. See, now he's I remember that.
I apologize to you. You look wonderful. No, my first question for you, President Zelensky.
In the same suit. You see, I changed your.
Maybe yours is much better than mine. Real quickly, upon peace, God willing we get peace, are you open to holding an election in your country?
Yes, of course. We are open for election, yes. We have to do safety circumstances, and a little bit we need to work in the parliament, because during the war you can't have elections, but we can do security. We need, maybe, how to say, we need a truth, yes, everywhere, in the battlefield, in the sky, in the sea, yeah, to make possible for people to do democratic, open, legal elections.
So you say
we're ready.
during the war you can't have elections. So let me just say 3.5 years from now. So you mean if we happen to be in a war with somebody, no more elections? Oh, that's good. I wonder what the fake.
You like this idea?
Yeah.
No.
Speaking of news, I got a question for you. This sounds insane for me even to ask this, but do you think the American media really doesn't even want a peace deal because they've seen they've been so critical of you every step of the way as you lead the charge for peace?
It's an amazing phenomenon. I said that if in the settlement you got Moscow, St. Petersburg, and thousands of miles around them, they would say, I made a bad deal. The level of hatred and animosity is incredible. Not with all. I mean, we have great people up here. We also have terrible people up there that I think are told what to say. But, you know, in solving all of these wars, they don't even write about it. You know, I saw major wars. I saw wars that have been going on for 31, 35, and 37, and a couple of quicker ones. One that was going to go into a full-blown deal very quickly. You know what the one I'm talking about. It was a big one. But they don't even write about that. No matter what I do, no matter what, and you know, this is not anything to do with you. It's probably to your advantage in a certain way. But no matter what I do, no matter what deal I make, from my standpoint, you'll come out good. Maybe President Putin will come out good. But they'll say, Trump was absolutely horrible. It's just that, and I've lived with that for a long time. I've lived with it since just before the first election. I used to get great publicity. Now I get the worst publicity anyone's ever gotten in office, but I won in a landslide, so that people understand. They're the only ones that count, ultimately. But I've also had great reporters. I've had journalists that are very good. But it's very sad when you do the right thing. As an example, they said, because of the fact that Vladimir Putin came to American soil, this was a tremendous defeat for Donald Trump. No, it was really wonderful that he did it. It was a hard thing for him to do, to be honest with you. It was the opposite of what they said, but they said it. Now, if he didn't come, they'd say that was also bad for Trump. You know, there's no way. And there's just a great dishonesty of the press, and I think that's why it's lost its credibility. You know, its credibility is at an all-time low. We have a thing going on right now in D.C. We went from the most unsafe place anywhere to a place that now friends are calling me up, Democrats are calling me up, and they're saying, sir, I want to thank you. My wife and I went out to dinner last night for the first time in 4 years, and Washington, D.C. is safe, and you did that in 4 days. I'll tell you it's safe. I had another friend of mine, he has a son who's a great golfer, he's on tour, and he came in 4th yesterday in the big tournament where Scotty Scheffler made the great shot. And he said his son is going to dinner in Washington, D.C. tonight. I said, would you have allowed that to happen a year ago? He said, no way, no way. He said, what you've done is incredible. And I think the people realize it. But the press says, he's a dictator, he's trying to take over. No, all I want is security for our people. But people that haven't gone out to dinner in Washington, D.C. in 2 years are going out to dinner. And the restaurants the last 2 days were busier than they've been in a long time. Thank you.
I walked around yesterday with MTG. If you could walk around with D.C. with MTG and not be attacked, the city is safe.
Thank you, Mr. President. Last week, you warned of what you called severe consequences if a 30-day ceasefire or any type of ceasefire were not agreed to by Russia. Will there be severe consequences? Does that change because of
I don't think you need a ceasefire. You know, if you look at the 6 deals that I settled this year, they were all at war. I didn't do any ceasefires. And I know that it might be good to have, but I can also understand strategically why, well, you know, one country or the other wouldn't want it. You have a ceasefire and they rebuild and rebuild and rebuild, and, you know, maybe they don't want that. But if you look at the 6 deals that we made peace and you know, long-term, long-running wars, I didn't do any ceasefires. Would I like the concept, you know, I like the concept of a ceasefire for one reason, because you'd stop killing people immediately, as opposed to in 2 weeks or 1 week or whatever it takes. But we can work a deal where we're working on a peace deal while they're fighting. They have to fight. I wish they could stop. I'd like them to stop. But strategically, that could be a disadvantage for one side or the other. But all of these deals I made without even the mention of the words ceasefire.
President Zelensky, can you explain the decision to offer Ukraine Article 5-like security guarantees, but stop short of pushing for their full membership?
Yeah, well, we haven't done anything on that yet. If you look back and you go back long before President Putin, it was always a statement that they would never allow Ukraine into NATO. So that was a statement that was made, but we haven't discussed any of that yet. We're going to be discussing it today, but we will give them very good protection, very good security. That's part of it. And the people that are waiting for us, they are, I think they're very like-minded. They want to help out also.
Thank you, President. Thank you, President Trump.
Are you disappointed there's no ceasefire,
The United States has already given hundreds of billions of dollars to this war effort in Ukraine. At best, it is a stalemate, and the killing continues. So, President Trump, how much more is the United States willing to give Ukraine? And President Zelensky, how much more do you want?
Well, I'll start off just by saying we're not giving anything now. We're selling weapons. This is something before, I guess the number is well over $300 billion. That was under Joe Biden, a corrupt politician, not a smart man, never was. By the way, go back 40 years, he was not a smart man 40 years ago either, but now he's in particular bad. This was done by a corrupt administration that shouldn't have been in, and frankly, if the right results of the election were given, if I were president, this war would have never taken place, and he would have been very happy, because he would have liked to have seen. I mean, they went through hell. He went through hell. This war would have never happened, and the people that were killed, a couple of million people, a lot of people with soldiers and everything else, and the people that have been displaced and forced into other areas and other countries because of what's happened, none of that would have happened. And I'm just saying that he was a horrible president, whether it was the borders or this. He was just a horrible, corrupt president.
Thank you so much. So first of all, we have possibility now to buy weapons from the United States. We are thankful for this program and this opportunity. We are thankful for Europe. They pay for this. And through NATO program, for example, Pearl and etc., we have some programs where we can have some money to finance this. And this is a part, I think, it's not a part for the war and to defend us. It also will be a part for security guarantees, to strengthen our army, to rearm Ukrainian army. This is very, very important. And it depends how much money we need to rearm. For example, the question of air defense, we spoke about it with President Trump, and I'm happy that we have now bilateral decisions and we work on it with production, American production. Nobody in Europe has so many air defense like Patriots, for example. We need it very much, and this is also about defending.
I think the good news, we make the best military equipment in the world by far. You mentioned the Patriots. How good are they?
Yeah, systems.
We have systems, they're literally 100% foolproof. And it's really like shooting two bullets, two bullets hitting each other in the air in a space like this. The chance is 100%. It's 99 to 100%. So we sell the equipment to NATO. And NATO does what, I don't know what the arrangement is that you have with, but I know that they want you to have the equipment. And we're getting the best equipment in the world, but they pay us for the equipment. Under Biden, it was just crazy what was going on. I believe the number is over 300. I think it could be $350 billion worth of equipment and money and everything else. And we've made more progress in settling this war in the last 2 months than they made in 4 years. This should have been settled a long time ago, but it should have never happened. Yeah, please.
Real quickly, you pushed out on social media.
Brian, go first.
You pushed out on social media about doing away with mail-in ballots and potentially electronic voting machines. Can you expand on that and how important
Well,
that is?
that's a very off-topic, just really quickly. Mail-in ballots are corrupt. Mail-in ballots, you can never have a real democracy with mail-in ballots. And we, as a Republican Party, are going to do everything possible that we get rid of mail-in ballots. We're going to start with an executive order that's being written right now by the best lawyers in the country to end mail-in ballots because they're corrupt. And you know that we're the only country in the world, I believe, I may be wrong, but just about the only country in the world that uses them because of what's happened. Massive fraud all over the place. The other thing we want change are the machines. For all of the money they spend, it's approximately 10 times more expensive than paper ballots. And paper ballots are very sophisticated with the watermark paper and everything else. We would get secure elections. We'd get much faster results. The machines, I mean, they say we're going to have the results in 2 weeks. With paper ballots, you have the results that night. Most people, but most people, many countries use paper ballots. It's the most secure form. So between paper ballots, very, very important, paper ballots, and I think maybe even more important, the mail-in voting. We're going to end mail-in voting. It's a fraud. If you have mail-in vote, even Jimmy Carter with this commission, they set it up. He said the one thing about mail-in voting, you will never have an honest election if you have mail-in. And it's time that the Republicans get tough and stop it because the Democrats want it. It's the only way they can get elected. Because with men and women's sports and with transgender for everybody and open borders and all of the horrible things, and now the new thing is they love crime. They're fighting me on the fact that I've made Washington, D.C. safe. We're not going to get mugged, beaten up, or killed like all the people you've been watching get so badly hurt. I'm glad, I hate to take your time with this, but I'm glad you asked me that question. Sorry. We're going to stop mail-in ballots because it's corrupt. You know, when you go to a voting booth and you do it the right way and you go to a state that runs it properly, you go in, they even ask me, they asked me for my license plate, for identity. I said, I don't know if I have it. They said, sir, you have to have it. I was very impressed, actually. But it's very hard to cheat with mail-in voting. As you know what happens in California, it's so corrupt, where some people get 5, 6, 7 ballots delivered to them. Now, we got to stop mail-in voting, and the Republicans have to lead the charge. The Democrats want it because they have horrible policy. If you have mail-in voting, you're not going to have many Democrats get elected. That's bigger than anything having to do with redistricting, believe me. And the Republicans have to get smart. We're not going to have a country. I said for a long time at rallies, you need borders and you need free and fair elections. Those two things, otherwise you don't have. We have strong borders now. In 90 days, Mr. President, we didn't have 1, 0, 0, and 3 months. Not one person came in illegally into our country. In fact, even I find that hard to believe, but it's run by a little bit of a liberal group that put out the numbers, so I guess it's, but 0, 0, and 0. You go back a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 millions of people poured into our country. It was terrible. Thank you very much.
What security guarantees do you need from President Trump to be able to make a deal? Is it American troops, intelligence, equipment? What is it?
Everything. Really, it includes two parts. First, strong Ukrainian army. That's what I began to discuss with your colleagues. And it's a lot about weapon and then people and training missions and intelligence. And second, we will discuss with our partners. It depends on the big countries, on the United States, on a lot of our friends.
And Mr. President, are you willing to commit American troops to that NATO-like protection in order to get President Zelensky to a deal today?
Well, I don't know if you define it that way, but NATO-like, I mean, we're going to give, we have people waiting in another room right now. They're all here from Europe, biggest people in Europe, and they want to give protection. They feel very strongly about it, and we'll help them out with that. I think it's very important. I think it's very important to get the deal done.
You've been involved with the peacekeeping in Ukraine since your first day in the administration. What would you say to the Ukrainian people right now who are suffering under the Russian attacks and hoping that the American people will stand with them?
Well, I know Ukrainian people. I've known many over the years. They're great people. They're smart. They're energetic. They love their country. I mean, they love their country, and we want to get this war ended. That's all I can do. I love the Ukrainian people, but I love all people. I love the Russian people. I love them all. I want to get the war stopped. Very important.
Mr. President, was there any aspect of your discussion with Vladimir Putin that left you disappointed?
Look, we just spoke to, I was just telling the president, I just spoke to President Putin indirectly, and we're going to have a phone call right after these meetings today. And we may or may not have a trilat. If we don't have a trilat, then the fighting continues. And if we do, we have a good chance. I think if we have a trilat, there's a good chance of maybe ending it. But he's expecting my call when we're finished with this meeting. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, press. Thank you.
Okay.
Keep moving.
The press availability there has just wrapped up. Fascinating to watch President Trump sitting next to President Zelensky, of course, flanked on both sides by their closest aides and advisors and members of President Trump's cabinet. So there you have it. We just watched about 20 minutes or so, 30 minutes or so of the president and President Zelensky, both of them speaking together, taking questions from the media. Now, a reminder of what we heard there, a few really interesting nuggets. A reporter asking President Trump about those remarks that President Zelensky can end the war immediately if he wants. President Trump said he thinks that's true, and he thinks that Russia, Ukraine, and the U.S. will have a trilateral meeting. And he was asked whether there was a good chance of a deal today and whether this was the end of the road. And he said, I can't say that. People are being killed. We want to end the killing. Now, he was asked as well, who has the better cards? You might remember back in February in that infamous meeting with President Zelensky, he said to him, you don't have the cards, we have the cards. Well, he was asked about this today, and he said, I don't want to say who has better cards. He said, it's Joe Biden's war. We want it ended in a way that is good for everyone. Now, he was also asked about security guarantees, and he said that the U.S. will be there. He pointed out that European leaders are standing by in another room, that they want to be the first line of defense, as he put it, for Ukraine going forward, but that the U.S. will be there in support. He didn't give much more detail on what that could look like. He did interestingly say, I don't think you need a ceasefire to end the war. Now, this is a point that is a big point of contention between the Europeans and Ukrainians and the U.S. Remember, President Putin fought against having a ceasefire, and we saw President Trump embrace that line and say that he wants a full peace agreement. Well, he said it might be to a disadvantage to one of the sides to have an immediate ceasefire. He said, you know, I like the concept of a ceasefire to stop killing people, but we can work on a deal, and while we are working, they fight. I wish they could stop it, but strategically, and he's pointing here to President Putin of Russia, saying that is a disadvantage for them. He was also asked about continued support for Ukraine. He said, we're not giving anything now, we're selling weapons. He repeated something he said often, which is that the U.S. has given around, well, President Biden, his predecessor, gave around $350 billion worth of support to Ukraine. That number is not what is actually reported. The numbers we have is that number is closer to around $175 billion. Nonetheless, President Trump continues to repeat that figure. And he was asked about NATO-like security guarantees as well. And he said, NATO-like, well, the people in the other room, the Europeans, are the ones who are going to be talking about that. So he said that's going to be a key point of discussion today. And just to say, there were a few moments of lightheartedness there in the room, despite the very serious nature of these talks. Remember that President Zelensky was criticized last time he was here for not wearing a suit, criticized by a supporter of President Trump who works for Real America's Voice. And that same reporter complimented President Zelensky on his suit today. President Zelensky turned back to him and said, you're wearing the same suit. So a brief, lighthearted moment there. But despite that, Vitaly Shevchenko here with us from BBC Monitoring, the Russia editor. Interesting, first of all, to see the body language between these two leaders. Very different this time.
Well, it could not have been a more different meeting compared to what we saw here back in February. I think this time around, all the people involved, they've drawn their conclusions and their lessons. And Trump and Zelensky, they did their best not to sound confrontational, despite the difference of opinion they might have on how to end this war. Volodymyr Zelensky, I don't think he got to speak that much, and maybe he didn't want to speak a lot, because what he had to say may be very, very different from what Donald Trump wanted to hear. So at the end of the day, we didn't learn that much about what exactly is going to happen during these hugely important and very tense negotiations. Donald Trump is still saying, no, we don't need a ceasefire, we need something more permanent, which is different from what Volodymyr Zelensky said before. Volodymyr Zelensky kept thanking the American leader time and again. So that, again, is very different from what we saw back in February, when he was accused of not thanking him enough during that meeting in the Oval Office. And the questions that we heard from reporters, they were very good, very pointed, but both presidents, they did their best to answer, not to answer them directly.
What did you make about that point of the ceasefire, where he said it might not be advantageous to some sides? This was a question that he has been pressed on because it's a key demand of the Europeans and the Ukrainians.
Well, absolutely, and that's what Donald Trump said before his meeting with Vladimir Putin in Alaska on Friday. He said he was going to try and secure a ceasefire with Russia, and then more substantive talks when the guns and the missiles were silent. But that went out of the window. Emerging from his summit with Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump said, well, actually, we're not interested in a ceasefire. We want a more permanent solution. So that was disappointing to the Ukrainians, and that is one huge reason why we have so many European leaders here who want to make sure that Donald Trump doesn't help Vladimir Putin defeat Russia by accepting Vladimir Putin's conditions.
And before we let you go, Vitaly, as I know you'll be following closely what's happening inside the White House, as are our colleagues from the Ukrainian service who are inside the White House at the moment. What did you make of what President Trump had to say about security guarantees? He said the U.S. will provide good protection. Hard to know what exactly that means.
And that's a key question. What does he mean, good protection, given that the United States has been really reluctant to provide a firm guarantee of supplying weapons, maybe deploying troops to Ukraine. That has been ruled out. Also, supplying weapons to Ukraine free of charge. That is something that has happened, has stopped, and Donald Trump is really happy, really proud that now America is selling weapons to Ukraine, not just giving them away. So when it comes to security guarantees, for them to work against Russian aggression, Ukraine will need to hear something a bit firmer, something that will force Russia to rethink its approach to Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Vitaly. And I also want to bring in our guest, Anton Grushetsky, who's a pollster and the executive director of the Kyiv Institute of Sociology. Anton, what did you make of what we've heard so far?
I need to say that from the point of view of public opinion, we have the same situation. 76% of Ukrainians strongly reject any peace plan for peace. It's actually a surrender plan, so Ukrainians are not ready to officially recognize any part of Ukraine as part of Russia or cede some territories. But at the same time, 54% of Ukrainians are ready to accept European and Ukrainian plan that includes freezing the front line in exchange for the firm security guarantees. Also, our survey showed that we are flexible with security guarantees, and Ukrainians surely prefer NATO membership or peacekeepers, but the majority of Ukrainians could even accept no peacekeepers, no NATO membership, but only increased supply of weapons, like 100 more F-16, 500 Tomahawks, financial support to our army, and we'll feel safe.
Anton, you know, we heard a message from President Trump there where he said, I love the Ukrainian people, I love the Russian people as well. You see, he was really holding his cards close to his chest in a way when asked about ending this war. How concerned are you or Ukrainians about the position President Trump is taking in these negotiations?
Surely Ukrainians are concerned because the USA is one of the strategic partners of Ukraine. But while 63% of Ukrainians believe Europe and the UK are true partners of Ukraine for the just peace, as for the US, we have only 42%, and it was even before this Alaska meeting. So 90% of Ukrainians trust ordinary Americans, but 70% of Ukrainians distrust American leadership. So people are concerned. People are not expecting breakthroughs and not expecting like ceasefire and close peace, but people at least want a steady weapon supply, try to defend ourselves, our people.
And Anton, just quickly before we let you go, what do you hope is achieved in this meeting today? What would be the best scenario?
Best scenario to receive a steady support from the US in the form of weapons and some like to understand Ukrainian position that Ukraine shouldn't surrender to all Russian demands. Ukrainians are flexible, but shouldn't be pressed to surrender.
Okay. Anton, really good to get your take. Thank you so much for joining us here on BBC News as we've seen those images, of course, of President Trump and Zelensky in the Oval Office, just getting set for their talks, their bilateral talks. We saw them flanked by the delegations that they had brought along. And we saw a very different image than we saw back here in February when we saw that blow up in the White House. This time, friendly words exchanged. President Zelensky didn't speak very much, but we did see President Trump speak about what he says is the U.S.'s plans to have this war ended. We are waiting to see European leaders, of course. There you see some flags. Those are from people just outside the White House here and there. We're waiting for that family photo. So we're going to keep a close eye on everything happening here. We'll be back with you in a moment.